1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, events, and more across our country, as well as across the surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. Back.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Hope everybody is having a good morning. I want to get to the headlines in just a second here. Jamarl, you actually have an update from yesterday. This is after last week's events having to do with your YouTube channel. Do you want to tell the listeners what's going on here?
Yes. So I am in another issue with Google, with YouTube. Yesterday, I did a video, basically the monologue I'm going to do today, that Trump should be impeached. In order to do that video, there was information that I needed from various sources. One was Sidney Powell and the lies that Sidney Powell was basically telling about Hugo Chavez, Venezuelans, et cetera, et cetera. I uploaded that video to private because I wanted it as a reference. And while uploading the video to private, I went and did the other video referencing the video that I have that was, unlisted. Meaning the first video, nobody was ever going to see. Nobody ever saw. It had like one view, and that view was me. That video was never going to be seen. It was only there as a reference. Flat fact, I have other videos like it. I even have a section called playlist called For Reference. So that's what this was for. I do the video, I make my argument, I look up, and the video was taken down. Now, the reason they said it was a scam, it was a spam, or it was deceptive content. None of it was a lie. All of it was flat fact true. The video was there as a fair use video, which is allowed apparently by law. And nevertheless, it didn't matter. It's almost as if they didn't even understand the context of the video. That they heard Sidney Powell and they just say this is deceptive. Or that they saw the other video said this is spam, despite the fact that the video wasn't even shown. How can it be spam if nobody sees it? And how can it be deceptive if everything in the video is flat fact true? The documents and the information that was being put either by Trump himself or by Sidney Powell were things that they were saying in the election or before the election or after, and that failed put him. The idea that you can't explore that is shocking, utterly shocking. This is a publisher. Let's stop pretending that YouTube is a platform. This is a publisher. Section 230 shouldn't apply.
Well, I hear you on that one. Yeah, there's another side to that. Maybe I'm worried. I don't know. But it kind of reminds. I think this is their algorithm. This is where I'm going to push back slightly. Again, they should not be doing this. They should be assuming for a moment at least, which I'm going to, that this is just their algorithm going haywire. They should be more on top of that, because that's a large part of their business model. Is not just people posting videos with ads, but getting people who are confident enough in their platform to use them to post videos with ads. Admittedly, though, I'm sure that you, along with the other alternative political voices out there, are just a margin for them, that they're more than happy to shave off if it averts some liability. But the algorithm, it's getting so paranoid. I'll put it like that. It kind of reminds me of Hal from A Space Odyssey. If you've seen that 2001: A Space Odyssey, the great Kubrick film. I'm sorry, Jamarl, I can't do that.
Yeah, that's a headline. Yeah, that's a classic. That's a cult classic of 2001.
Exactly. Yeah, no, Kubrick is a great director in general. Anyway, we got to get into the headlines here. I just wanted to give the audience a quick update on the saga of YouTube last week demonetizing, then this week undemonetizing, and now suspending.
The first time around, they said, our bad. We were a little aggressive in getting rid of your channel. Now think about that. Like, it's so cavalier. It's as if they don't believe people make a living on YouTube. And the easy way, meaning if you and I, if I had you as an employee and you did something, let's say you did something I didn't particularly like, I acknowledge and understand that you getting paid is your ability to pay for your family, to pay for your rent, to pay for your food, etc. And it would take something pretty extreme for me to stop you from getting paid, either through firing you or taking your wages. YouTube does it on the fly. They don't care at all. You have people who have 20, 30, 50,000, 100,000 subscribers. They don't care. And that is deeply problematic and troubling. On top of just the fact that they're willing to give her the speech.
They're being an abusive partner in a relationship.
Yes.
Where first they slap you, and then a couple of days later they profusely apologize for it and try to re-embrace you. And then like the next day they escalate and like shove you or something like that, where it just they go back into it and get worse. Now, admittedly, in my opinion at least, you know, there is a human element to this, but especially with what happened yesterday, that's also the algorithm cutting in. But that doesn't actually alleviate the fundamental concern, which is YouTube has tuned their algorithms to be so paranoid, especially about certain people, it seems, that they'll just cut you off, which is something they should be working on. We've had massive developments in AI over the past couple of years. You'd think that some of that would have been brought over into their moderation, their sort of self-moderation policies. But we got to get into headlines. Only have so much time at this point. That's a damn shame, though. In COVID news this morning, it is the third straight day in which we've had less than 100,000 new cases reported. This is the first time since October, basically, in months at this point, since we've had less than 100,000 new cases per day. And again, it's the third straight day. At least 3,167 new deaths, however, that's still pretty damn high. Over the past week, there has been an average of 108,144 cases per day. That's a decrease of 35% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 27,233,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and just over 468,000 have died from it. Chicago's teachers have approved a COVID-19 safety deal that paves the way for students to begin returning to classrooms. The vote appears to end a long and bitter dispute between the Chicago Teachers Union on one side and Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the nation's third largest public school system on the other. The Chicago Teachers Union said early Wednesday that 67% of the roughly 20,000 members who cast ballots electronically had opted to accept the agreement. More than 25,000 were eligible to vote. Terms included more teacher vaccinations and guidelines for closing schools if there's a spike in COVID cases. Pre-kindergarten and special education students whose parents choose to have them return for limited in-person learning can come back Thursday. Elementary school students can return March 1st, and middle schoolers on March 8th. No plans were announced for high school students. At least 36 people may have developed a rare blood disorder known as, and I'm probably going to bungle this, immune thrombocytopenia. That's as close as I can get to it, after taking either Pfizer and BioNTech or Moderna's COVID-19 vaccines, according to a report submitted to VAERS, the government's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. The condition develops when the immune system attacks platelets, a blood component essential for clotting, or the cells that create them for unknown reasons. Ghana's parliament has been suspended for at least 3 weeks following a surge in COVID-19 cases among parliament members and staff. Speaker Alban Bagbin announced the suspension late Tuesday, saying that at least 17 members of parliament and 151 staffers have tested positive for the coronavirus. You know, enclosed, sometimes tight spaces, those are ripe conditions for spread. He has urged lawmakers and other parliament staffers to get tested. Any traveler who visits England from a red list country faces steep fines and a possible 10-year prison sentence. This according to Britain's Health Secretary Matt Hancock, under a new policy that came into effect this Monday. There are 33 countries currently on that list, including South Africa, Portugal, and all of South America, from where travel to England is effectively banned, largely because of concerns over new variants of the coronavirus. I think they have a little bit of egg on their face with the UK variant spreading too, but they're trying to prohibit the spread from other countries. That makes sense. I don't really have too big a criticism, but it's just they're banning the spread from countries that have these new variants. Well, they have their own new variant. I don't know. Last COVID headline here: the Wisconsin pharmacist accused of intentionally attempting to destroy nearly 500 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine formally pled guilty in federal court Tuesday. Prosecutors charged Stephen Banberg, 46, with 2 counts of attempting to tamper with consumer products. The charges carry a maximum combined sentence of 20 years in prison and $500,000 in fines. In national political news, impeachment trial began yesterday with oral arguments, and a divided U.S. Senate voted largely along party lines to move ahead with Donald Trump's impeachment trial on a charge of inciting the deadly assault on the Capitol on January 6th. The Senate voted 56-44 to proceed to the first ever trial of a former president, rejecting his defense lawyer's argument that Trump was beyond the reach of the Senate after having left the White House on January 20th. And apparently, former President Donald Trump was quote-unquote furious and quote-unquote beyond angry over his defense team showing on day one of his second impeachment trial, despite his ultimate acquittal being almost certain. Trump's attorney, Bruce Castor, gave a rambling 45-minute opening argument, including praising the House impeachment managers for a job well done. Trump watched the proceedings from his quarters in Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. Minutes into her confirmation hearing, President Biden's nominee for director of the White House Office of Management and Budget, Neera Tanden, had to address concerns over hostile tweets she has posted against various Republican lawmakers. We'll be coming back to Tanden a little bit later in the show, by the way. Talking about Sanders and a pushback from the left, but for now, talking about Republicans, the first Republican on the Senate Homeland Security Committee to question Tanden, Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, immediately brought up Tanden's posts, many of which she deleted late last year. Neera Tanden apologized and told senators Tuesday that she deleted more than 1,000 tweets in November because she, quote, regretted her tone, end quote. She said regretted my tone, and that nobody advised me at all to describe the social media account of harsh comments ahead of her nomination. Gregory Ulrich, the 67-year-old man accused of killing one person and wounding 4 others during the Tuesday morning shooting at the Alena Healthcare Clinic in the Minnesota city of Buffalo, was quote-unquote very familiar to law enforcement and was upset with his treatment. He has been taken into custody. Buffalo Police Chief Pat Budke said that most likely the shooting was targeted at that facility or someone within that facility, end quote, given the suspect's history of conflict. The center released a statement saying for both patients and staff, the shooting at the healthcare center that killed 1 person and wounded 4 others has been traumatic. A special tribunal in Bangladesh's capital on Tuesday sentenced to death 8 Islamic militants for the 2015 killing of a publisher of books on secularism and atheism. Anti-terrorism Special Tribunal Judge Majibur Rahman announced the verdicts in a packed courtroom in the presence of 6 defendants. Another 2, including sacked military official Syed Ziaul Haq Zia, remain at large. In October 2015, suspected militants hacked to death Faisal Abidin Dipan of the Jagriti Prakashoni publishing house in a market near the Dhaka University. On the same day, another publisher survived a near simultaneous attack, also in Dhaka. Polish independent media suspended news coverage and the web pages of the country's leading news organizations were blank Wednesday morning. This is a protest against a new advertising tax that many say would restrict free speech. Although the tax would also affect social media companies, its most prominent detractors say it would hit mid-sized publications the hardest. Poland's human rights ombudsman has said, quote, I have no doubt that the aim is to hit the independent media, end quote. The revenue from that new tax will go to funding Poland's National Health Fund. France's government wants to set the age of sexual consent at 15 and make it easier to punish long-ago child sexual abuse, this amid growing public pressure and a wave of online testimonies about rape and other sexual violence by parents and authority figures. Calling such treatment of children, quote-unquote, intolerable, the Justice Ministry said in a statement that the government is determined to act quickly to implement the changes that our society expects, end quote. Politicians, prominent intellectuals, and academics in France have voiced concern that, quote, out-of-control leftism and cancel culture, end quote, from the United States is threatening French identity. They are arguing that American ideas on race, gender, and post-colonialism, especially those coming from U.S. universities, are undermining French society and are an attack on French heritage. The collection of intellectuals arguing that France is being contaminated by the leftism of America was buoyed last year after French President Emmanuel Macron appeared to side with them. We will come back to that. I'll just say that like this. We'll be coming back to that in the 9 o'clock hour. The European Commission's president, Ursula von der Leyen, has said she deeply regrets the EU's threat to revoke Article 16 in its spat with Ireland and the UK. As the Union deals with a vaccine crisis spurred by what some are calling vaccine nationalism, European Union leaders threatened to reimpose controls on the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland after requesting vaccine distributions from Northern Ireland, even though the region is part of the Brexit customs union. Von der Leyen admitted that mistakes were made in those negotiations. She also criticized the union's vaccine approval and procurement process so far, saying, quote, "We were late with the approval, we were too optimistic on mass production, and perhaps we were also too certain that the orders would be delivered on time," end quote. In Earth and Science news, the polar vortex has become synonymous with winter's most brutal cold. For days, the weather system has been sitting and spinning right along the U.S.-Canada border, with temperatures as low as 43 degrees below zero in northern Minnesota. Ahead of this Arctic blast, there will be a series of winter storms along the collision zone of cold and warm air, bringing ice from Texas to Tennessee and significant snow to Washington, D.C. And in business news, Dutch beer brewer Heineken said Wednesday it plans to cut 8,000 staff, nearly 10% of its global workforce, as part of a cost-cutting reorganization after a pandemic-dominated year that saw it sink to a net loss of 204 million euros, $248 million. With bars and pubs around the world closed during coronavirus lockdowns and alcohol bans in some of its markets, Heineken sold 8% less beer than in 2019. Revenue fell nearly 17% to 23.8 billion euros. And with that, those were our headlines. A lot to talk about in them, but we're out of time. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we'll be back in just a minute with our soapbox segment, hearing from Jamarla and getting into a conversation about a certain political issue. Be right back.
Fault lines.
Great job. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. This video is up on an alternate channel. If you guys want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy to call in. Also, for those of you that want to go into the alternate site, it's at the Progressive Soapbox or the Prague Soapbox on YouTube. You can go to my Twitter account and it'll have a link to it. I did a video yesterday because I thought the video was timely and I thought the video was on point. And so because that video was basically destroyed, I am going to do a segment of that video today because I do think the point is still very relevant, actually, because it's still going on. Donald Trump's impeachment. From my perspective, Donald Trump's impeachment should go through. In fact, if it was based on the soul of the nation of America, it must go through, even though I know that the Republicans aren't going to join in. I am usually the person who makes the argument that selective justice is not justice. If 20 people are guilty of a particular crime, but the political instrument goes after one or two because those people are, let's say, on the outskirts, that is by definition selective justice. It doesn't matter that the people are guilty. It matters more so that the political instrument is making a choice to go after some and others. It is by definition unfair and not the role or not the objective of a political instrument. I wasn't against the first impeachment. I thought the first impeachment massively jumped the shark. They were looking for anything to impeach Donald Trump on. And they came up with that petty nonsense that Joe Biden himself was basically guilty of. This, however, is different. He jumped the shark. Donald Trump did a failed putsch attempt. It doesn't matter that he was doing it in the open. It doesn't matter that the phone calls and everything was leaked and that it was kind of comical and ridiculous. It was still a putsch attempt. The attack on the Capitol was the end result of that. From my standpoint, unless you want to replicate that behavior into the future, you impeach. The impeachment is there not for Donald Trump just as a political figure, not just to keep him from out of office later on, but also to put a benchmark down on what we will not accept as a society and as a community, especially if they're going to break the rules. Donald Trump betrayed his oath to office, he betrayed his oath to the Constitution, and more importantly, in a deep, fundamental, and indelible way, he broke the social bargain. That bargain that says, I will comply with your laws because I have some input in those laws. And as long as all of us are playing this particular game where you may win sometimes, I may win sometimes, the moment that you decide that you no longer want to play the game, that because you lost, it is now time to throw over the table and just take all the pieces, that is deeply troubling and deeply problematic. And it is not something that should be allowed to prosper or pass without a deep, abiding, and vicious condemnation of the behavior. Otherwise, you're going to replicate that behavior later on. If George Bush was impeached, do you think that Obama would have been so cavalier with killing thousands of people with drones, with going into Syria, killing hundreds of thousands of people in those civil wars, or the war that he was basically provoking, this insurgency against Assad, another government? I don't care what you think of Assad. I care about the fact that the actions cost 500,000 lives. I don't care what you think of Bush or the idea that Bush may be rehabilitated. I care that Bush was responsible for hundreds or thousands of American lives, not to mention nearly 1 million Iraqi lives. I care about the chaos that was caused by our actions and that was given a pass when Obama looked at it and said, I'm going to look forward. I'm not going to look back at the torture, the mass surveillance, and basically the destruction of habeas corpus. Those aren't things I'm going to look at. I'm going to look forward and just ignore the crimes. There is no criminal that gets that pass. And yet, George Bush, war criminal, part of the in crowd, gets to walk. My point is that was not a beneficial act. It didn't help us going forward, and it set an implicit point of view that was on some level okay. The putsch attempt should not be allowed, nor should he be given time to prosper. People can make arguments that, hey, Donald Trump is not in office. You can even make arguments, per se, that this stuff doesn't rise to the level of an insurrection, that it shouldn't be just a political condemnation. There should be some more legalistic aspects of this. I don't take those arguments. Donald Trump acted in bad faith, which is the question. It is not an issue to me whether or not Donald Trump thought in the beginning that the election was bogus. That was okay. I had no issue with Donald Trump going after the results. I had no issue with him trying to get his lawyers, to get his people to go all across the United States and figure it out. Where's the evidence? Where's the thing that shows we were cheated? But the problem is that after all of that was exhausted, after all of the mechanisms that Donald Trump has at his disposal, we're talking about like a billionaire that is president, that had all means in the world at his disposal, more than anybody else, to go out and look and find those issues of fraud, those issues that show that he won this election in a landslide, as he keeps telling his millions of supporters who believe him. Shouldn't there be something more than just his thoughts? The answer is yes. In that office of the president, you get wide berth to screw over the public. You could maim people abroad. You could lock people up. You could fleece the public out of trillions of dollars. You could dump huge amounts of money into the military while pulling that stuff away from healthcare, education, etc. You can look squarely in the public's face and says, yes, I'm going to build a wall, and I am going to furlough all of your ability to get jobs and work during that time frame, meaning you're not going to get paid if I'm not going to be able to build my wall under the emergency measure. You can even blow off the responsibility of the nation regarding ensuring health care. So 450,000, nearly 500,000 people died of COVID as a direct result of incompetence. It's not that I'm saying every last death was associated with Trump, but it would be weird if you don't accept the fact that the guy screaming that masks are unmanly would have a negative effect on stopping or slowing down the COVID trend. I hope you understand what I mean by this. Trump is responsible. Bad faith is the point. Did Donald Trump have a good faith belief that he himself was being cheated? And if he didn't have a good faith belief that he himself was being cheated, then that means he was stoking the crowd, stoking the audience with lies, knowing, infinitely foreseeable, that the audience will respond in the way that the audience responded. The putsch attempt had a lot to do with A, trying to get the governor or the Secretary of State to blow off and find votes somewhere, invisible votes, and then threatening him with the idea that if he didn't do it, it goes into trying to get Pence to break the law and do something that Pence didn't have the power ultimately to do. It goes to him pushing the other Republicans to basically fall in line with zero evidence of him trying to have this to do. And yes, if you go for over a month stoking a crowd that you're being cheated, that America has been destroyed, that it's been taken by the other party, and you got 30 million people, there's a probability that a good share of those people may respond in the way that they responded with the raid on the Capitol. I didn't have to know what day it was going to take place for me to be months ago saying it was going to take place because it was infinitely foreseeable. There's a clip here of Dershowitz. And in fact, we'll get to the clip of Dershowitz later. I'm going to end it, and I'm going to let Shane get in to give his point of view on this. But from my point of view, I've been, oddly enough, honest about Trump in comparison to the other people who push against Trump. I've been straightforward in things that I didn't particularly like or things that I thought he was unfairly treated on. This, I'm very clear on. This could not be allowed to prosper. And the arguments that need to be made need to get directly to this notion of, did Trump believe he was actually being cheated out of that race? And if he did not believe it, this bad faith argument creates an infinitely foreseeable situation of the public responding violently, especially if you're telling them that the United States Constitution has basically been overthrown because Joe Biden was working with the communists and the CIA to do it. This is an aggravating thing, and it's not something that I love, per se. But yeah, it is necessary. Shane, what are your thoughts? Am I too strong on this? Should Trump not be impeached? Do you believe he should get a pass, or how do you feel about it? What are your thoughts?
I'll put it like this. If I agree with you, there needs to be some sort of resolution of a president's inability to fulfill their duties or to abuse them in different ways. But I think the resolution for that, the way that you deal with that, is through elections. And in this one, by most accounts, Trump lost it, and pretty handily, and Biden won it, and with a significant enough margin that, there's, even though a bunch of people have alleged election fraud, all that stuff, that frankly continues to happen regardless. What was the difference? What was the margin between? It was like 8 million votes, something like that.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge amount. I mean, I think Trump got like 4,000 or 4 million more votes, or 14 or something. He got a huge number of additional votes on what he had in 2016. He did. Yeah. But
arguably that's largely due to the mail-in voting, which, for some reason I haven't heard people bringing up as much as I feel like they should be when it comes to how many more votes he took in. I think the Democrats, I don't know. I guess my point is there was a significant enough margin that it wasn't like Bush versus Gore in Florida close. It was a bit bigger. My point is Trump lost the election pretty handily, not in a landslide certainly, but there you go. I'm worried that if we use the impeachment process in the future, if we set ourselves a precedent of trying to use it as a sort of general resolution of public sentiment, then we're going to do ourselves a lot of damage. It is supposed to indict presidents for crimes. And as far as I can tell, on the issue in which he's being impeached, Trump didn't commit any. Admittedly, while the events were happening, he lagged to respond to them. He waited for, in my opinion, too long. A couple of hours is too long. It should have been minutes, or it should have been, before they breached the building, cautioning them against it and asking them to go home. And there should have been more of a National Guard response. I will come out with that stuff right in front. And then even in his dismissal of them, even as he was asking them to go home, he said, "You're very special people and I love you," which in my opinion is ridiculous and obscene and just, is another foot down into the earth. He was 6 feet under or 7 feet under politically at that point. He was like 10, digging his way to China, which would be ironic for Trump. But here's my point on this one. I don't think that we should make impeachments. We should try to make them about resolving questions of the public will. That's the tendency. That's the basic human tendency. By default, if there's a key moment like this, if there's a key political moment of judgment, the trend outside of the legal system is to try to leverage that moment as an indictment of whatever the politician did wrong in the eyes of the public. That is inherently what comes up. You get a lot of feelings. There's this chance to put somebody in a position of power on trial. And when you put people on trial, it's not usually just restricted. In some ways, of course, the judge tries to restrict it to the issue at hand. But you also have moral character comes into it. And, a previous history of associated alleged crimes, all that stuff. I guess my point here is that, that comes into it. That shouldn't be the point of it. The point of an impeachment is whatever legal issue is at dispute is supposed to be resolved. And in my opinion, Trump is innocent on those grounds. Having said that, I thought he handled COVID terribly, and there are many other aspects of his presidency that are worthy of indictment. But does that make sense, Jamal? What's your take on that view of this?
It does make sense. I accept the attempt to balance it. I don't buy the argument, though. And the only reason I don't buy the argument, two reasons. Look, if that was true, and which it probably is true, it does create a certain degree of strife if you're going to impeach. But that's irrelevant. At any impeachment, there will be people who would be backing the president, and it would be that divisive thing. So there was no way out of that. That's a box that either you have impeachment or you don't. Meaning you either remove impeachment off the board, or there are times where you use it. And to me, this would be the time to use it, if not another time. Also, during the time we told him they were nice people, he was also telling them that the election was stolen, they robbed us, etc., etc. And he had to go back later and say, all right, guys, you guys suck because it's embarrassing that you guys did this. No, I think impeachment goes beyond just this notion of legal. I think this also goes to the notion of condemnation. And what does the nation tolerate and what it doesn't. And I'm sorry, representative government, democracy, whatever you want to call it, is fractured and as ossified as it is a fragile thing. And the moment that it is broken, it is not something that you can put back together again. Humpty Dumpty will remain broken.
Let's get into that argument this week. This is going to be an ongoing thing. We don't have enough time for this segment, but this is going to be ongoing. So, we'll go back and forth on that. I do not think Trump should be impeached on this, to be clear.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Let's do this. Let's go into our next break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Right now, we are in a weird moment in American history. There seems to be a waning of American power in regards to its influence around the world. Some people like to call it soft power. And there's a belief that the moment that soft power starts to wane, more hard power issues come into play because of the inability to influence. There's a really interesting article written by the next guest, Bradley Blankenship, called The Multilateral Era Has Begun, making the point that Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader in Iran, made the point that the post-American era, or the post-U.S. era, has started. Very interesting conversation. Joining us is Bradley Blankenship, Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter, whose column can be found on RT and CGTN.com. Brad, what's going on, man? Thank you for joining us.
Hey, what's going on, guys?
Absolutely. So I've read this article, and I think I agree with the premise of the article, even though it makes me a little concerned. Now, and this gets into the whole thing of, reality doesn't conform to my own ideology and stuff like that. Because it gets to the issue of foreign policy and the way countries behave in foreign policy. I often think countries do what they can in the sense of foreign policy, where the international law doesn't actually exist. That ability for a country to take advantage of another country is dependent upon solely on whether that country is strong enough to avoid being taken advantage of, not because of international law. There's a difference in those things. And from the standpoint of Iraq or Syria or Libya and these countries that we've been involved in back to back, or the coups that we've been trying around the world for Venezuela, the fact of the matter is Syria didn't fall, Venezuela didn't fall, and Iran hasn't fallen. All of these were targets of the U.S. None of these were able to be taken down. You consider this a multilateral error for the weakness of the U.S. in trying to accomplish these things, but the inability to do so. Please expand on that. If you think I said anything wrong, please correct. But otherwise, please expand on.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I don't know, maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote a column saying that Syria would be the graveyard of American imperialism, and I think going back to the article of mine that you mentioned, actually 13 years ago, Vladimir Putin, exactly today, February 10th, gave a speech at Munich. And this is at the end of George Bush's tenure as president of the United States, George W. Bush, after the disastrous war in Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan, and so on. And he said in Munich, he mentioned, which is a quite popular term in Russia, but also international politics generally now, the idea of a multipolar world. And if we look at just world history generally, there has rarely ever been a unipolar world system. Even for example, Rome or the various empires in China or Egypt, there was other empires around the world that either they didn't know about. Now, in the case of China and Rome, there's actually evidence now that they did have some communication, but nobody ruled the world. In such an era, Putin wisely said at the time, though he was condemned in the West as invoking a new Cold War, this kind of thing doesn't happen. And if it did happen, it was extremely unsustainable. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. The U.S., exactly after that time, was when the Americans did their last serious act of aggression with the West, with the coalition of the willing or European countries, when they invaded Libya and took down Muammar Gaddafi. And it was after that moment, and I believe Putin himself actually personally said after witnessing the death of Gaddafi, that just horrible murder of that man, and said, something like this is never going to happen again. And sure enough, nothing ever happened like that again. There was no invasion of Syria. I think a lot of people, when we saw what was happening in Syria, we thought Bashar al-Assad, his days were numbered, but he stood strong. Same thing with Maduro in Venezuela. And the more you look, the more you see that American influence and power, either soft or hard, is just not what it used to be. Since Putin gave that speech in 2007, or I should say, since the invasion of Libya, the NATO-led invasion.
And let's go back for just a second. We're talking about unilateralism, the return to a sort of multilateral world. The modern unilateral era was created, I would say, at the end of World War II, when the United States was left standing, along with the Soviet Union, as the only two remaining sort of great powers in the world. And of course, that set us up for the Cold War. The United States turned out to be stronger, or at least more stable over that period, with the Soviet Union falling in the late 80s, early 90s. And right around that time, this is where I'm going with this, you had a couple of articles coming out from conservative thinkers, some would say neoconservative thinkers in the U.S. You had Francis Fukuyama, with his End of History and the Last Man, which was first an article, then he released his book. Then you had Samuel Huntington with his speech, then article, then book, A Clash of Civilizations. Now, Fukuyama's argument, it might seem like I'm getting into the weeds here, but these are significant books, significant ideas in the context of this exact debate, unilateralism, multilateralism, and the sort of future of the political order. What Fukuyama said was democracy, all of the world's countries are transitioning into a democracy, and that is in some sense the last political stage of mankind. We're entering into this era in which, the liberal dream has been fulfilled. People's interests are represented through representative government. And we're sort of reaching this pinnacle of political development. Now, that doesn't mean that history is over, but it means in some sense that political history has its climax in the sort of Hegelian sense. Anyway, Fukuyama released that. Huntington responded saying that, no, you have these different civilizations. You have the Islamic world, the Russian world, the English or American world. You have these different competing ways of life that are going to battle each other. So even at that moment, this is the early 90s, 92, 93, I think we saw clearly a side that represented unilateralism and then a side that saw there was a return to multilateralism. Now, I disagree with both of those thinkers on the crucial points. I think that we are effectively living in one world civilization, as we were talking about yesterday. But at that point, this debate was, for some at least, sort of set up in those terms. And it seems to me pretty clear, like you're saying, from 2007 is a good demarcation, but increasingly clear over the last decade that the United States is in decline. Trump brought this to the eyes of many, but for anybody who was really watching, it was obvious before that, and that other countries are coming back to the fore. Now, the question here, of course, is, does this set us up for a wave of political violence? Does this set us up for a century of sort of internecine global squabbling and warfare between different countries, particularly as the United States tries to maintain its power, maintain its hold on its former unilateral legacy? What's your take on that, Brett? Is this going to be a more violent century coming up?
Well, personally, I don't think so. I think after the end of World War II, that's when we created the United Nations. We created the United Nations Charter, the fundamental principles of international law that made the nation state sacred in many ways. Now, of course, we saw a lot of violence after World War II in many wars, to be sure, but things have certainly changed. And I think, for example, if you look at where the last two world wars have began in Europe, I mean, it's definitely not going to happen here. I mean, the Americans are trying to draw Europe still, under Joe Biden, the great liberal Joe Biden, trying to draw the world into another Cold War with China. And, that's just not going to happen. I mean, Angela Merkel took a very hard stance. Emmanuel Macron a few days ago told the Atlantic Council in English in a speech, to a Washington, D.C. think tank, and said that it would be basically unwise for the EU to engage in trying to contain China. I mean, I don't see that we're going to get to that point. Now, maybe if there's a revolution in the United States, I think it could get pretty brutal, because I think the government there is pretty unhinged. I mean, this is just my speculation, but I think really if the Washington government was going to fall, I think they would really, go to no lengths or leave no measures unused to try to contain that. But around the world, will we see another world war? I highly doubt that. And I think generally when you look at, what was the non-aligned world, when you look at what was, the West, quote unquote, actually, I spoke on this program in August about Mike Pompeo's visit in Europe. And it became very obvious to me, seeing him here in Prague, but also in other countries, hearing about what he was doing there. It's just really obvious that the coalition that the United States had is falling apart. So I don't see that there could be some great war again.
Well, just to back up Shane for a moment, there does seem to be a bilateral world developing. I mean, if you're thinking of the U.S., you still have influence in various states in the European Union. I mean, Huawei was a really good example of that. Even the pressure on Angela Merkel for the pipeline, even that shows pressure. I mean, even though she might, at the end, decided not to do it, she still listened to it, and they were going back and forth and vacillating over it based on the U.S. Influence and pushing on it. I guess I think I almost agree with Shane on this. Not so much that there will be a war that might be started necessarily in Europe. My concern is that the U.S. jumps the shark, and that you have various countries. Because think of it like Britain for the moment. Britain was, what they call it, a white man's burden, basically owning over half of the world after the First World War. But it was somewhat of a brutal empire after that. But they still had in their head that they were an empire, and they were masters of the world, even when they weren't. And they ended up jumping the shark themselves and basically being pushed back down when the United States and many other nations tell them that they couldn't stay in Egypt. I guess I'm saying that the U.S. has a certain point of view in the same way. And that point of view of the world bothers me, because that point of view, to me, can lend us into wars. That's where I'm getting at this, and that's where I think Shane may be hitting this from. And by the way, it does seem like it's broken into parts. The United States, parts of Europe, then you have Russia, China, you might have Turkey, in this case, depending upon how it breaks down, Iran, Syria, et cetera, et cetera. Does that concern you at all? Or do you think that that's a credible concern, or you think that's overblown?
I think it is a bit overblown. And I think, when you look at, for example, the fall of the British Empire, the British basically just handed this off to the Americans in kind of a whimper. Now, there was, some revolutionary wars in some places, but generally it was not some kind of cataclysmic event. I don't think the Soviet Union was an empire, but if we look at their political system and the various republics that came after, I mean, certainly there was political violence for some time, but it was not the very serious rupture. Like, for example, in Central Asia, there was not like massive political violence and wars for generations. I mean, it was pretty quickly a resolved issue, and now we see independent countries, for example, in that region. Now, that's not to say that there's not political instability. I think there will be political instability as the world tries to realign and shuffle itself. And that's just also in the context of the pandemic, the global economic hit that, the entire world took this year. I think we're also in the next few months going to see a financial disaster. So, I mean, we've got definitely a lot going on here, and there's going to be a lot of instability, political instability just being one part of that instability as the world realigns. But in terms of, hard power war, I just think things are a lot different since the United Nations Charter was founded. So
from your mouth to God is, Brad, and I hope you're right. I mean, I honestly do hope the multipolar thing puts people in check. Like you said, this one policeman around the world, and then the policeman goes insane. What's wild about this, and I'll end this. Bradley Blankenship is a Prague-based American journalist, political analyst, and freelance reporter whose column can be found on RT and CGTN. You can follow Bradley on Twitter at @BradBlank_ and find his writings on RT.com and CGTN.com. Shane, there's an aspect of this where Superman, which represents America even in the colors, goes insane after Lois Lane is killed and basically tries to take over the world and get rid of all the violence in the world. This is called the Injustice series. And I strongly suspect that Injustice series has a lot to do with our current, let's say, political scene that is leaking into the comic books into that character. It is a fascinating, almost commentary on our country. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Peter Oliver.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're talking about Scotland for a moment and the UK in general. In Scotland, a scandal is brewing against Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland and leader of the Scottish National Party, alleging that her party and possibly Sturgeon herself conspired to create charges of sexual harassment against former First Minister Alex Salmond. Recently, Craig Murray, formerly an ambassador and now a historian, political activist, and blogger, has submitted a sworn affidavit supporting the case against Sturgeon and the SNP. Murray is a longtime proponent of the Scottish independence movement, by the way. To discuss this all, we are joined by Peter Oliver, an EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, thank you for joining us, and let's get into it. What's being alleged in this scandal, and how significant is it within Scottish politics?
This is, it's a huge deal because of what is coming up in Scottish politics. There are elections taking place in Scotland for the devolved parliament in the country. That's coming up very soon, in the next couple of months, in fact, and campaigning pretty much getting underway, or as much as campaigning can get underway with the current climate. Now, the fact that Nicola Sturgeon is being targeted directly in this is a big deal, because the Scottish National Party is the dominant party. The SNP is the dominant party in Scotland. They pretty much wiped out the Labour Party a little while back and have the whole hog there. But what we are seeing at the moment is the growth of the a Scottish independence movement again. Now, we had a referendum a few years back in 2014 on Scottish independence. It was a very narrow affair. It ended up voting in towards the side of remaining part of the United Kingdom. Whether that would be the case if there was another referendum, well, it doesn't look likely at the moment. Most of the polls would suggest that a Scotland would vote for independence from the United Kingdom. What we're seeing at the moment is, though, this scandal coming out, it does not look great for Nicola Sturgeon and for her Scottish Nationalist Party. So those who will be wanting to remain within the Union will be pointing out is, look at what has gone on here before. Not great for them at the moment.
This is really strange. Attacks so in the United States, just to give a comparison for the moment, it doesn't take anything for Hillary Clinton or, let's say, Elizabeth Warren to basically say the person is being sexist against me. And the public is like, ooh, they're being sexist against them. Now, the reality of it doesn't really matter. The same thing with anti-Semitism charges. Oh, that person cares about Palestinians, so you're being anti-Semitic because you care about Palestinians. Again, it's utterly ridiculous, but at the same token, it's always honored. Why is this one given so much credibility? From the standpoint of Jeremy Corbyn, they used to use the same thing against him, saying he was anti-Semitic because he cared about Palestinians. And they used that as a way to basically decimate him. Why on earth are these charges coming up against... Go ahead. I'm sorry.
With Alex Salmond, you've got to remember there was a criminal trial last March. He was acquitted, cleared of all 13 charges against him. The 9 women who made the allegations included an SNP politician, a party worker, and several current and former Scottish government civil servants and officials. But all of those charges, he was cleared on. So the fact that this has come up again, well, it is seemingly a chance to try and to get involved. The fact that this has come out again is a chance to get involved in that debate. But on the Jeremy Corbyn issue, I mean, he is still suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party. He was allowed back into the party itself. Those anti-Semitism allegations, those claims that came out following the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, they don't go away. They are indelible stains, and they're used to constantly smear Jeremy Corbyn himself, as well as those on the left of the Labour Party in the UK. Worth noticing, though, that those who are in the Labour Party a little more inclined to go towards Keir Starmer, the current leader of the party, who's very much dragging the party towards the centre. Those that were tied to him, who were named specifically in that report into anti-Semitism, have been, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, readmitted to the party, but forgiven, basically. Thinking about Emily Oldknown, who's the Unison General Secretary. She was admitted just last week, but she has close ties to Keir Starmer. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, not.
And so isn't this in retrospect very clearly revealed to the British public? And that's what I'm curious about. As a ploy to get to get Corbyn out of the leadership, isn't that all that this was, frankly? And isn't that clear now? How do you think the British public is receiving this? And what's your take?
And wait, just to piggyback on that, the fact that they are coming up with these charges against her sets the precedent. Meaning the fact that they're saying, well, wait a minute, they did this intentionally from the standpoint of calling sexual harassment and everything else, shows the premise, or at the very least, a sandbox version that they're willing to do stuff like that for political ends. And just piggyback on Shane's question, please continue.
You'd think that perhaps it would, but you've got to remember that British politics is a very insular game. I'm speaking to you right now from Germany. Being able to look at it even from this far away gives you a more of a bird's eye picture of it. Just to put into context, everything that's gone on with the UK at the moment, you've got Boris Johnson with an 80-seat majority. He can do anything he wants. His government can make all of the decisions and put it straight into practice. 114,000 people have died. Around 1,000 people every day are dying with COVID-19. And instead of challenging the Conservative Party over their failings, you've got the Labour Party fighting amongst itself again. And in fact, the Tory Party, the Conservatives, poll from the 8th of this month, that's just Monday, shows that the Conservatives have actually gained 3 points in the polls. Despite what would be a litany of failings, they're able to still point to the fact that they've got a good vaccination programme, and that is what they're using. It's not great when your opposition can't successfully oppose because they're too busy fighting one another.
It's darker than that. It's darker than that, unfortunately. So there's an article that came out in Independent yesterday. Group of left-wing MPs and unions have called the labor leadership, Keir Starmer, to hold emergency conference as they warn of widespread, quote, anger and disillusionment in the party. They're calling an emergency meeting. The Boris Johnson government, with all of the deaths from COVID-19 and all of this other stuff, labor is in complete disarray, where they are literally saying, this is an emergency, this is an emergency. Hey, maybe don't carve off your left wing in ridiculousness and attempts at calls at anti-Semitism. How about that? Maybe you don't do that. Can you speak on that? That's utterly obscene.
When Keir Starmer took over, you got to remember, Keir Starmer served right alongside Jeremy Corbyn on the opposition front bench during Corbyn's time as the party leader. However, he has done everything in his power to distance himself from the former leader since he took over. And what we've seen is, I've actually got the motion in front of me. It was put forward by a number of unions, by left-wing members of the party and by left-wing MPs. It says that discussion in local Labour Party meetings has been suppressed, motions have been banned, that anger and disillusionment is exploding across the lay membership and across the party. Members are leaving in droves. Many are frustrated that there are attacks on democracy and free speech, and that people don't feel like the Labour Party is the Labour Party anymore. And it's right what you say. I mean, the left of the Labour Party, there's been attempts to cleave it off from the rump that is being ruled by Keir Starmer. However, in doing that, what they've done is they've upset the left of the party to a point whereby in June we may well get a emergency party conference. At that party conference, Keir Starmer could face a leadership challenge. Now, if that happens, well, you know, if you're Boris Johnson, if you're in Conservative Party headquarters, you think, well, we've just been given, well, free ride, because the Labour Party is going to be continuing to tear themselves apart over who's going to be the leader next, if that leadership challenge is put in place like it's expected it will be, if this conference goes ahead. And of course, coming up in May, there are elections taking place in the UK. Councils and City Hall elections will be taking place. There'll be a chance for Keir Starmer's Labour Party to get a run out in front of the public. It has come in for a bit of criticism, quite a lot of criticism over the messaging that they've gone for. They wanted to focus on the union flag and on veterans. If I can point you in the direction of another media outlet, I would really recommend anybody checking out Joe Glenton's piece in Novara Media on veterans and the culture war off the back of that. Very interesting read. But there's a huge section of traditional Labour voters who are currently saying, what does this party stand for? What is the party about? I'm from one of the areas, I'm from the northeast of England, a place called Sunderland, which is traditionally the heartland of the Labour Party. It has remained that, but you've got to remember, in 2019, there was huge amount of seats voted Conservative for the first time because of Brexit. A lot of that was down to, but what they haven't been able to do under Keir Starmer, what he thought he was going to be able to do, was get those people back on side. They haven't done that so far, and now he may well face a leadership challenge after not very long in charge of the party at all.
And here's the thing. So Starmer's playbook was recently released. Of course, we've talked about this briefly. In that playbook, it was revealed that he and other Labour Party members, leaders, were trying to reach out to the middle across the political aisle on the issue of Brexit. But if I'm remembering this correctly, wasn't the pushback, a lot of it at least, against Corbyn, because he was trying to do exactly that? He was trying to reach out, not necessarily reach out, but out of his own convictions, was a little bit more in favor of Brexit than the others. Again, I'm looking at this from even further away than you are in the United States, but it seems like that would strike the British public as contradictory. Is one word for it. What's your take on that, Peter, in the last minute?
Jeremy Corbyn's take on Brexit, there can be books and whole courses in university and politics looked at that. Jeremy Corbyn isn't a fan of the European Union. However, he was the wrong type of not fan of the European Union, if you can understand what I mean by that. That his left-wing opposition to the EU didn't fit with the liberal right-wing agenda of being against the European Union. Basically, he sold the wrong type of message of being opposed to the EU. When it came to the actual campaigning in the referendum, he basically sat it out because the vast majority of Labour were against Brexit. There was a lot of people against Brexit. But in sitting it out, he didn't really endear himself to those who were opposed to the Brexit debate. The Labour Party at the moment. That would be my sum up for you guys of how it's going in the United Kingdom. The more you dig into it, the more convoluted, the more twists and turns, the more, well, it's a civil war within the Labour Party, and
that sounds messy. Peter, thank you for the summary there, and thank you for joining us. For those listening, that was the voice of Peter Oliver, EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You can follow him on Twitter at PeterGOliver_RT and catch his reporting weekly on RT International. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines in the news, and I suppose we started off with information on my channel. Look, those of you who are listening to us or who are watching us who found the YouTube channel in the alternate site, basically what boiled down is I did a video yesterday on Donald Trump's impeachment. To do that video, I uploaded a 1-minute clip of Sidney Powell saying some outrageous things, and I had that set to unlisted because the clip was never meant to be aired. It was demonetized, and if I'm not mistaken, I think I might even put it in a folder called for reference because that's all the video was for. On top of that, do a video going after Trump, saying it was ludicrous, going after the claims, etc., etc. My channel gets shut down saying I was pushing spam, deceptive content, or scamming. Now, it can't be spam because nobody saw the video, with the exception of myself because it was referenced. And it can't be false if the information that I'm putting in the video is true and pushing back against claims. And yet, that was in and of itself enough for them to shut the channel down for a week. So, I've been working with YouTube trying to get them up, but this is the alternate site, so you guys can view on this if you like. This is the Progressive Soapbox alternate site. So that's what's going on basically with the censorship thing on YouTube. It is aggravating. There was nothing in the video that was spam, scam, or for that matter, deceptive. All the things in the video was true, and everything was pushing back against the notion of the lies. And yet, either they don't get the context or whatever, but this is radically unfair and problematic in the way that they're going about making these decisions. But let's get to the headlines.
They definitely don't get the context. I just to briefly add in, that's what makes this ridiculous, is that anybody who listens to this show or your channel knows that you would be pushing back hard against Sidney Powell's claims.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so ridiculous to me.
It's so aggravating. Because it's one thing if I do something wrong. If I do something wrong, I get it. Even if it's somewhat subjective, I can get it. But to say that prior I was in harmful content is a lie. It's defamatory, and it's basically, I consider it slanderous. From the standpoint of saying I'm putting out spam, deceptive content, or spamming, again, to me, it is defamatory. It's a slander against me and my channel and what this channel produces. So yeah, I was apoplectic when I was getting my point across to the various people on YouTube about why this is wrong. So yeah, they, with all the AI, all the technology, all the money that they get, all the money that they take from the people who work, buy more people and have more human eyes on that. And even with the human eyes, have something on top of that where there's a transparent process where you're making these decisions. But this, where you're willing to just give rid of people's wages and a whim, is deeply problematic and deeply troubling. Let's go to the headlines. At least 3,167 new coronavirus deaths and 96,460 new cases were reported in the United States on February 9th. Over the past week, there's been an average of 108,144 cases per day, a decrease of 35% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Wednesday morning, more than 27,233,000 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus, and just over 468,000 have died from it. Chicago teachers have approved a COVID-19 safety deal that paves the way for students to begin returning to classrooms. The vote appears to end a long and bitter dispute between the Chicago Teachers Union on one side and Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the nation's third largest public school system on the other. Chicago Teachers Union said earlier Wednesday that 67% of the roughly 20,000 members who cast ballots electronically had opted to accept the agreement. More than 25,000 were eligible to vote. The terms include more teacher vaccinations, guidelines for school closing if there's a spike in COVID cases. Again, sane, rational ideas. Pre-kindergarten and special education students whose parents choose to have them return for limited in-person learning can come back Thursday. Elementary school students can return March 1st, and middle schoolers on March 8th. No plans were announced for high school students. And again, the idea, I suppose, is that younger kids have a lower propensity to spread it, whereas older people or older kids basically spread it to the degree of adults. So yeah, it makes sense that more deference will be given to high school students. At least 39 people, by the way, they shouldn't have had to fight for that. Just to make a point. You shouldn't have to fight to ensure that your health is taken into consideration from the job that you're doing. The fact that you have a union is the thing that was fighting back and pushing back against those claims. Compare this to a situation where there was no union and the company or the group that the individual has to push up against, that individual is alone fighting this conglomerate that is making a determination about whether or not they get paid or not. Transform this to Amazon. What happens if there's no union in this process? At least 36 people may have developed a rare blood disorder known as immune thrombocytopenia after taking either the Pfizer, BioNTech, or the Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine, according to reports submitted by VAER's, the government's vaccine adverse event reporting system. The condition develops when the immune system attacks platelets, a blood component essential for clotting, or the cells that create them for unknown reasons. Interesting. Yeah, that needs to be investigated. Because that's going to be something that people point to as, aha, we told you so. And fact of the matter is, I don't necessarily know if that gives more bang for the buck for that particular argument that there's something wrong with the vaccine. I got to be honest, even with this particular illness, we have, nearly 500,000 people dead. It's a hard argument to make for me with 3,000 people dropping dead that a small percentage, a tiny percentage, they may develop this issue, even though I don't undermine or undercount the fact of the people who end up with it. I just think it's, we can talk about it later. Ghana's parliament has put a mental note for that for when we get the doctors on to discuss. Ghana's parliament has been suspended for at least 3 weeks following a surge in COVID-19 cases among parliament members and staff. Speaker Alban Bagbin announced the suspension late Tuesday, saying that at least 17 members of parliament and 151 staffers have tested positive for coronavirus. He has urged lawmakers and other parliament staffers to get tested. Any travelers who visit England from, quote, red list, unquote, countries face steep fines and possible 10-year prison sentences, according to Britain's Health Secretary Matt Hancock, under a policy that came into effect on Monday. There are 33 countries, including South Africa, Portugal, and South America, where travel to England is effectively banned, largely over concerns of a new variant of the coronavirus. That's funny, considering England is a red list state itself. That's pretty wild. But fair enough, I get it. It's just funny that it's like America saying, we're going to have a red list of countries where COVID is bad. I get it, but let's just be honest. You're the country where COVID is bad, UK. The Wisconsin pharmacist accused of intentionally attempting to destroy nearly 500 doses of COVID-19 vaccine formally pled guilty in court on Tuesday. Prosecutors charged Stephen Brandenburg, 46, with 2 counts of attempting to tamper with consumer products. The charges carry a maximum fine of 20 years in prison and $500,000 in fines. That is wild. Shane, I don't know if you looked into the story. What was the reason, if you know, that he gave for wanting to do this? It just seems so bizarre as a crime to commit.
I have no idea. I could speculate, but I'm not gonna. I do not know.
Yeah, that's so bizarre. Yeah, that's so bizarre. Let's keep going. A divided U.S. Senate voted largely along party lines on Tuesday to move ahead with Donald Trump's impeachment trial on the charge of inciting the deadly assault at the Capitol. The Senate voted 56-44 to proceed with the first ever trial of a former president, rejecting the defense lawyer's argument that Trump was beyond the reach of the Senate after having left the White House on January 20th. Now, Shane, you disagree with me on this. Because to me, I thought he was guilty of sin, and that for the soul of the nation, you guys can go back and listen to the monologue, Trump needed to be impeached. Yeah, that's pretty hyperbolic, right? For the soul of America, he needs to be impeached. But that's where I am. That's why I'm putting my flag down. Wait, and there's one more thing for this, and I'll bring you in. Apparently, former President Trump was furious and beyond angry over the defense team showing on day one of the team's second impeachment trial, despite his ultimate acquittal being almost certain. Trump's attorneys, Bruce Castor, gave a rambling 45-minute opening argument, including praising the House impeachment managers for a job well done. Trump watched the proceedings from his quarters in Mar-a-Lago and Palm Beach, Florida. What do you think, Shane? What do you think? What are your thoughts on these two statements? I did the monologue, so I want you to kind of give your point on why either he shouldn't be impeached, why you agree with this or disagree with this, or whatever context you want to give on this at all.
Well, yeah, his legal team has failed him in this case, at least on that ground. They sort of were courting the Senate as they would, frankly, if they're trying to win a case. You generally want to be friendly to the people who are deciding based on your testimony. So it makes sense that they would do that. But I think Trump saw this based on what he was trying to get his lawyers to talk about from early last week and the weeks prior. He wanted to use this to go back over his allegations that there was election fraud. He wanted to go over the details of the case. Now, in my opinion, in some sense, that actually makes a little bit of sense, just because that's the whole thing that he was doing here. For a couple of months now, he has denied the results of the election. And so in his eyes, I can see, okay, they have me on trial for this. Really, they have me on trial for disputing the election. Let's actually go over the facts. Now, that's the impeachment trial isn't, in my opinion, also not the time and place for that. I can see why he would do that, but it still doesn't make sense to me to do that. That's just setting it up as a backdrop. But again, coming back to the specific charges, I don't think he should be impeached on this. I do not believe he committed a crime. I think he was lagging, but he did tell his supporters to go home. And earlier in the day, when he told them to march on Congress, he told them to do so peacefully. So in my opinion, he handled this terribly, but I don't think he committed a crime, just to be clear. And I don't think impeachment should be the process by which you render judgment on a president's abilities or duties or whether or not they fulfilled their duties. That's the election, and he got voted out. So I think that's already done. That's my take.
And I disagree on that one. I think impeachment is explicitly for that, for a country in condemnation. I mean, because consider what needs to take place for an impeachment. You need, 2/3 of the Senate? I mean, that is a massive hurdle for you to do, not to mention with all of them being, many of those people being Republicans. It's almost a split Senate. If the Republican Party decides to impeach the president, for example, Richard Nixon would have been impeached by the Senate for his crimes. The election was almost irrelevant at that point. If the president commits high crimes and misdemeanors, or for that matter, do things that are a gross portrayal of office in America, yes, to me, impeachment is explicitly for that. And to put that demarcation point, this is not where we go as a country. This is not what we believe, and it would not be tolerated. And again, I point back to George Bush's impeachment. If Bush was impeached, would Obama have been so cavalier about going into Libya, or going into Syria, or putting boots on the ground, quote unquote, in all of these countries? I don't think he would have been. I think he would have had a lot more concern that he might have also been impeached for that behavior because of the past guy. I feel you. I get it. The country chooses. But within the context of the country chooses, that is not an absolute. There are rule sets that the country has to go by, regardless of what the country wants. So I feel you. I understand where you're coming from. And we're going to have this conversation with Garland anyway, so let's move on. Minutes into her confirmation hearing, we'll do it later. Minutes into her confirmation hearing, President Biden's nominee, director of the White House Office of Budget and Management, supposed to be Office of Management and Budget, Neera Tanden, had to address concerns over hostile tweets she posted against various Republican lawmakers. The first Republicans on Senate Homeland Security Committee to question Tanden, Senator Rob Portman, in Ohio, a Republican of Ohio, immediately brought up Tanden's posts, many of which she deleted last year. Neera Tanden apologized and told senators Tuesday that she deleted more than 1,000 tweets in November because I regretted my tone and nobody advised me at all to scrub social media account of harsh comments ahead of the nomination. Nobody had to tell her to do it if they told her she was going to be called for the office. She had good sense to do it. I mean, come on. Nobody had to tell you to do this. Also, the issue with Neera Tanden goes beyond tweets. Neera Tanden was the person that basically attacked. Well, look, we're going to get into this later regardless, but it's not her tweets. Her tweets are the least of her other problems with Neera Tanden. Gregory Ulrich, 67-year-old man accused of killing one person and wounding 4 others during Tuesday morning shooting at the Neera Health Clinic in Minnesota city of Buffalo, was very familiar to law enforcement and was upset with his treatment. He had been taken into custody. Buffalo Police Chief Pat Bootk said most likely the shooting was, quote, targeted at the facility or someone within the facility, unquote, given the suspect's history of conflict. The center released a statement saying, for both patients and staff, the shooting at the healthcare center that killed one person and wounded 4 others has been traumatic. A special tribunal in Bangladesh's capital on Wednesday sentenced to death 8 Islamic militants for the 2015 killing of a publisher of books on secularism and atheism. Anti-terrorism special tribunal judge Mujibur Rahman, announced the verdicts in a packed courtroom on the presence of 6 defendants. The verdict in a packed courtroom in the presence of the 6 defendants. Another 2, including stacked military official Syed Haq Zia, remained at large. In October 2015, suspected militants hacked to death Faizul Abedin Deepan of the Jagrita Praskshoni publishing house in a market near the Dhaka University. On the same day, another publisher survived in a near simultaneous attack, also in Dhaka. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys are in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So, an odd testosterone-fueled impasse has developed between Iran and the United States involving the 2015 JCPOA, the agreement between the United States and Iran to remove sanctions in exchange for severe limits on the capacity to enrich uranium. Now, Biden wants Iran to return to full compliance before the United States acts and makes a choice on whether to return to full compliance. Now, this is despite the fact that it was the United States that broke the agreement and escalated sanctions, including several murders and military bellicosity. This is not in doubt or questioned, and yet looking weak is frowned upon as it invites attacks by the opposition. So regardless of regardless that it's clear and unequivocal that the U.S. did not live up to the agreement and that Iran did live up to the agreement, it doesn't necessarily matter. We're in basically a Mexican standoff with neither country wanting to blink to go back to the agreement. To discuss this situation, we have with us John Kiriakou, former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of the books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. John, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, my pleasure.
So, eyebrows were raised recently. For the longest time, Iran said they weren't trying to get a nuclear weapon. Well, eyebrows were raised this. The situation raised eyebrows when Iran's Minister of Intelligence, Mahmoud, said, quote, "The Supreme Leader has explicitly said in his fatwa that nuclear weapons are against Sharia law and the Islamic Republic sees them as religiously forbidden and does not pursue them. But a cornered cat may behave differently from when a cat is free, and if the Western states push Iran in that direction, then it is no longer Iran's fault." Now, I have a hard time disagreeing with that because that just seems like reality to me. If you're putting pressure on a country and that country gets cornered and that country needs to defend itself, the country would do what every other country would and defend itself. And the issue of nuclear weapons is not an issue of attacks, it's an issue of defense. If I'd said anything there that's false, true, or you want to expand upon it, please do so.
Yeah, the Iranians would be foolish to say publicly that they're not interested in a nuclear weapon, even if they weren't interested in a nuclear weapon, just because it would take that off the table and it would bar them really from using what influence they might have at the negotiating table. The Supreme Leader has said repeatedly, frankly, over the years, that the Iranians will not build a nuclear weapon, that they should not build a nuclear weapon because it's anti-Islamic, and they don't have any intention of building a nuclear weapon. We know even from the CIA's most recent national intelligence estimate on Iran that the Iranians do not have a nuclear program. Now, they have the capability of enriching uranium, so if they so chose, they could build a weapon, but they don't even have a delivery system for it. So, I think that what we hear in the press here in the United States about the danger of Iran and the danger of the Iranian nuclear program, I think it's made up for domestic consumption.
Well, I think it's in part domestic consumption, but I think it's also an issue of political problem, if that makes sense. Like, the issue is not necessarily reality, it's the politics of it. If Joe Biden decides to go back to the JCPOA, Joe Biden is going to be attacked as being weak by the Republican Party, saying he's giving it all away, just like Obama was, he's giving the money. That nonsense. And a public that doesn't necessarily entirely paying attention just sees Joe Biden as being weak. Same thing is true in Iran, though. Even though it was the U.S. that pulled away from it, if Iran turns around and accepts the agreement without the U.S. doing it first, again, you undermine the various people in that particular country, meaning it's politically impossible to do so without having political consequences. How do we mend these two gaps?
Yes, I think you're exactly right. Look at it from the Iranian perspective, too. The Iranians, it was tough for the Iranians to come to an agreement on the JCPOA because they don't want to look weak, right? The country's essentially run by the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS, as part of a theocracy. But they have their own internal politics to have to worry about. So if they appear to rush to the negotiating table with the Americans, it makes them look weak, and they don't want to look weak. So they go out on a limb. They finally, kicking and screaming, go into the JCPOA. They sign the document. Donald Trump is elected, and the Americans pull out. And we leave the Iranians holding the bag. So we made them look weak. Now Biden is elected, and he says, we want to re-enter the JCPOA. Well, the Iranians have whiplash over this, and they don't think they can trust us. We're in it one day, we're out of it the next day. We get a new leader, we're back in it again. They're kind of tired of these antics.
Well, and let's try to set folks up for this, and I want to get your take on this. Isn't it the case, and please clarify if I'm wrong, that under long-term sanctions, the Iranians started their nuclear program partly to gain leverage in their negotiations
Absolutely.
with the U.S. How has that? I guess we'll start with them. Add a little spice to the pot. How has that worked for them? It seemed like that got the Obama administration to the table, and then from their perspective, how is their current policy a continuation of that? How effective will that be going forward, in your opinion, John?
Yeah, that's exactly what they did. And, they did it in a really smart way, too, because when they ended up going to the table to negotiate the JCPOA with us, the Brits, the French, the Germans, and the Japanese, they had something that they were willing to bargain away, something that was important to the West. When we pulled out of the JCPOA, everybody else remained in it. And the Iranians had that trump card of their ability to reinstitute this program if push came to shove. So maybe they've reinstituted it. Maybe they haven't. We're not really sure. The intelligence community hasn't updated the national intelligence estimate. But if the Biden administration wants to go back to the table, the Iranians have this thing that they can negotiate away, which is a program. I would add one other thing too, Shane. We've been so worried about an Iranian nuclear program for so many years. And we've watched Iranian nuclear cooperation with the North Koreans, with the Pakistanis, but we've never seen them test anything. They've never tested a weapon. The Pakistanis have, the North Koreans certainly have, the Indians have. The Iranians have never tested it. And as I said a minute ago, even if they had a rudimentary weapon, they don't have a delivery system to which they could attach it. And so I think that this program, if there is a program, and I really don't think that there is a concerted program, but if there was, it's not something that's advanced.
I got to be honest. I don't know why they would waste the money to do it. I mean, I understand.
Well, under sanctions, I don't know either. You're right.
Because basically, you could skin a cat using more methods than a nuclear bomb. I mean, if the entire point of the nuclear bomb is to cause a huge amount of havoc and destruction, which is basically the cause of any particular bomb, well, they don't need that. Saudi Arabia is right there. They have the oil fields. Yep. They have allies of the United States. I mean, you don't need those type of weapons in order to decimate or create massive havoc from the standpoint of the world oil. The Houthis, with that podunk device, was able to take down, 5% of the world's oil? And so,
in one shot.
Yeah. So it sounds like the issue of, the fear from the standpoint of the West or the United States is basically just a cudgel to hit these guys with and to basically try to prevent them from having any kind of expansion because of honestly, I would say is more about dealing with Israel as opposed to the United States per se. How do you see that?
I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, because it seems like it's keep putting us at the precipice. And one more point. They were always making the argument that the JCPOA was the last step to preventing a war with Iran. Can you speak about that? Because that seems like the weirdest thing in the world. If you don't want to go to war with Iran, you don't have to go to war with Iran. But for whatever reason, there seemed to be a consensus that is where we were going. Please discuss.
Oh, yeah. I totally agree. There are so many important points that you just made. First of all, you're right. The Iranians are not going to be able to create a program of any kind that is going to be a real threat to Saudi Arabia, to the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, those Gulf countries. They have the Gulf countries have so much money that they can outweight the Iranians under any circumstances, right? This is really about Israel. In that, we've been led to believe all these years that Israel is in a perpetual state of war with its neighbors. That's just simply not true. The Saudis have no real beef with Israel. I mean, we would say that the conventional wisdom is that the Saudis are on the side of the Palestinians and the Palestinians have been wronged and the Israelis oppress the Palestinians. The truth is that the Saudis don't care about the Palestinians. The Emiratis don't care about the Palestinians. The Kuwaitis actively hate the Palestinians because they sided with Iraq during the first Gulf War. And so the real enemy is Iran. And so they rely on us. Those Gulf countries rely on us to protect them against Iran. So they have a vested interest in making sure that we do not improve our relations with Iran. They have a vested interest in making sure that we maintain a military presence in the Gulf to protect them from the Iranians. Now, the JCPOA, I think, was great for everybody because it served to to begin to develop the Iranian economy. And this is where Iran has really been hurt by all these years of sanctions. It's not about a nuclear program. It's about developing the economy to put people to work, to allow them to put food on the table. That's why it was so important to them. And that's something that Israel doesn't want to see. It's something that many Americans don't want to see, especially on the political right. And it's certainly something that the Gulf Arabs don't want to see.
John, you know what? We're about out of time. I want to thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. You being
my
willing to.
pleasure. Thanks.
Hey, for those listening, absolutely. Good to talk with you, too. For those listening, that was the voice of John Kiriakou. He's a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. You can follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou. Learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com and check out The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, co-hosted by John with Lee Stranahan from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Radio Sputnik. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back talking impeachment and more with Garland Nixon. Be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So, the first arguments were heard in the Senate yesterday as Donald Trump's lawyers struggle to defend their client on the charge of inciting an insurrection. Now, this should be a Herculean task considering the weeks of animating the crowd with bad-faced arguments or being cheated out of a landslide win, threats to political leaders who refuse to set themselves on fire to back up Trump, and of course, culpability in the failed putsch. Just because it was lobbying in the open doesn't make it any less of a coup. It just means that Donald Trump was incompetent. Joining us to discuss Trump's impeachment, we're joined by Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Garland, what's going on, man?
Good morning, gentlemen. All is well. Looking forward to a great discussion.
Absolutely. So let's start here. Republican Cassidy was asked about this, and I want you to hear the clip that basically he's saying when he came out of the first round of testimonies. Let's play the clip, please.
You listen to it, it speaks for itself. It was disorganized, random, had nothing. They talked about many things, but they didn't talk about the issue at hand. And so if I'm an impartial juror and I'm trying to make a decision based upon the facts as presented on this issue, then the House managers did a much better job.
Senator, how about the video of the mob attack on the Capitol?
That is not the issue at hand. The issue at hand is it constitutional to impeach a president who's left office? And the House managers made a compelling, cogent case, and the president's team did not.
But how does it feel like that? Not that it affected your decision.
It speaks for itself. I think it's drama enough, but that's not related to why I made my decision.
Do you wish they addressed the past precedent of, the William Belknap and all?
They did.
The Trump's team?
Trump's team, yeah. I took notes. I always take notes. But at one point I leaned over to Cruz and I said, Cruz, are they talking to the point at hand? He goes, not now. Because I'm thinking maybe I'm missing something. And again, if I'm there as an impartial juror, respecting my oath of office to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and one side makes the argument and the other side does everything but make the argument, then to live with myself, I make that vote.
All right, so let's kill it there.
I've always said,
Garland, that's Representative Bill Cassidy, Republican.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't seem to be thrilled by Trump's lawyers on this. And to be honest, the reporting is that Trump himself was not thrilled with the lawyers' behavior or response in regards to this trial. I know you've been watching this also. What have been your thoughts on this? I mean, for one, let's start at the beginning. Do you think Donald Trump should be impeached? And on two,
Absolutely.
What do you think about what Bill Cassidy just said there? Again, Republican, who Trump would be hoping acquits him. What are your thoughts?
A couple of things. Number one, no, I don't think Donald Trump should be impeached. I've read the articles of impeachment. I have read Donald Trump's January 6th statement based on what they impeached him on. No, I don't think so. And based on reading the statement, no, I would say if I'm a jury, there's no way I can say that what Donald Trump said on that date created, the environment in which there was the protest and the ultimate occupation of Congress. So simply based on what he's charged with and what he said, I would argue that is A, it's probably protected speech, and B, that it didn't seem to incite anything. I mean, he used the word fight like hell, but let's not forget, if you read that, he also said, we're going to walk peacefully and patriotically over to the Capitol. He said fight like hell, but fight like hell is a very, very commonly used phrase in politics in the context.
Agreed.
He didn't say anything about physical. So,
but just to be clear, Garland, it doesn't matter if you said it about physical. If you and I were having a conversation and I stoked this audience over and over and over again with something that I knew as a flat fact would have significant consequences in regards to violence that may be created by the virtue of my speech. And I'm just a random guy. I'm talking about the president of the United States telling millions of people that the election has been stolen. It's not about one speech. It's about the bad faith arguments that Donald Trump stoked into the population for months. It's foreseeable. Shane and I were sitting here saying, hey, that sounds like that's going to cause violence. And it did just that. My issue is that Trump and this actions were foreseeable. Hence, the insurrection charge applies. Why am I wrong?
My position is this. I don't see that any different as what the Democrats did for 4 years with Russiagate, personally. I think if you got to charge him, if you say that he's stoking violence, you got to say that they're stoking violence. I mean, so now after 4 years of the 2016 was a fraud, 2016 was a fake, even though investigation after investigation shot down Russiagate, 4 years of that, and now all of a sudden, after 4 years of doing exactly that, now the country's going to say, well, if you do that, that's illegal. But and I might add, and we find instances such as Adam Schiff, who argued that the DNC computers were hacked by the Russians and blah, 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 after he knew for a fact that wasn't true, after he listened to congressional testimony under oath that said the opposite, and he claimed that he knew it was true. With malice and aforethought, he deliberately lied, having information. I'm just saying, if you're going to go after Trump for that, to me, I mean, I'm not just saying hypocrisy. I'm saying you've already showed with your precedent that the country doesn't consider that illegal. Now we're going to say, okay, we didn't consider it illegal for 4 years, and now we do. That's the one of the big issues I see. But based on what he said and specifically what he's charged with, I don't saying that it's for the I don't know. I just don't see that it's criminal. Specifically when you read the articles of impeachment and the statements that he made on the 6th.
Agreed. And this is an argument Jamarl and I have been having over the last couple of days. But no, I don't see it as impeachable either. And what I'm worried about is that this is going to lead to, not that they're going to go through with it, but if there's this idea that impeachment is your opportunity to redress grievances against the president, well, pretty much every president has had grievances lobbed against him by the public. And I'm worried that going forward, instead of elections, which are the natural recourse for choosing whether or not you want to continue to put that person in power, and in this one, Trump lost. Instead of elections, if you try to use impeachment, you're basically extending judicial tools, extending legal tools in order to serve whatever political end suits the power and party at the time. And I'm worried that that's going to have a pretty damn detrimental impact on our democracy if that happens. Now, it doesn't seem like it's going to. And admittedly, even if we thought that Trump was going to be impeachable, another problem here is that Republicans simply aren't going to do it. The numbers aren't there for it. They're not going to get the 60 vote majority they would need to be able to do this. So it's not going to happen. I guess on that point, what's your we've talked about the uniparty, this idea of this monolithic single party system that sort of bridges the apparent divides between Republicans and Democrats, and at the end of the day, how they both parties serve the same fundamental financial and military interests. Agreement on that, and yet it also seems like there is this gridlock between Republicans and Democrats that keeps government from functioning meaningfully. On the point of the impeachment, if you did, just for a second, if you had to put on the hat of assuming that maybe Trump was worthy of impeachment here, what do you think about this idea that they couldn't do it anyway because the Republicans wouldn't go in for it? This kind of reminds me of the whole bipartisanship conversation. Garland, what's your take on that?
A couple of things on all of that. Number one, I have long argued that I don't think impeachment was really made to get rid of a president. The bar is set so high, 2/3, 66, 67, whatever, 66 to pass. I argue that anybody that sets that system up knows you'll never get two parties to come that close together. I would argue when the Democrats had a 60 vote majority, they couldn't have got, and if they needed to impeach somebody in 2008, they couldn't have got 6 more Republicans. No party, people in a party are going to turn on their party and toss their guy out, except in extreme circumstances. So that's the other part. There's no chance of it happening, even though, the attorneys look like hapless bunglers. They could have wore a top hat and tails and did the old young Frankenstein sitting on the Ritz routine, and it would have been just as well, because we already know there is no possibility of a conviction. So to me, I don't understand what the point is. I don't really believe in we have to do this or that for the record. If you look at the Ukraine impeachment, in hindsight, it was a friggin' waste of time. And I think this is the same thing, particularly when, I'm going to add, we got real problems here. If they censured him when he was in office, if they did something that was real, okay. But we got real problems here. And I'm going to tell you right now, as soon as the Republicans get the House and the Senate, which eventually they will again, the first Democrat that says, we got to fight like hell and fight the fill in the blank, they're going after that person. And they're going to try to throw him out of office. And this is going to be the result of this foolishness to me.
Let's be straightforward. It's not just we're going to fight like hell. It's not just that Donald Trump was pushing back against the election. It's bad faith. That's the point. That he, in bad faith, stoked a crowd. And look, there's a difference. You can bring up Russiagate, but there's a distinct difference. You might consider it trite, but it is a difference. Donald Trump, from the standpoint of the election, attacked the American electoral system as being fraudulent. The Democrats attacked Trump as being corrupt. There's a difference in those things. The Democrats, for the most part, left the electoral system alone, if you think about it. They went after Trump and Russia, saying that Trump was working with the Russians to put out information to screw with the American public's point of view. They're saying that the minds of the people were infected, whereas Trump directly hit the electoral system and saying, I was cheated. You might consider it trite, but there's a dramatic difference between those two things. One indicts Trump and Republican and Russia. The other one indicts the electoral system. My point is our electoral system is a fragile thing. Democracy, representative government, for whatever issues that we have, is fragile. And yeah, I do think that there are situations where the president jumps the shark. He has wide berth to do all sorts of bad things. But if you're going to try to turn over the apple cart and end the game because you lost, that is dramatically problematic. And from a standpoint of a president, no, I don't think that should prosper. And that is exactly what he did. Russiagate has nothing to do with this. I understand that you may say, well, they attacked him in that way. Fair enough. But that's not exactly the way they attacked him. He is using a different motif to go about this. And I have great qualms about the destroying the electoral system, despite the issues that I have with the electoral system. And yeah, I do think a stake needs to be put in the ground to say this is not a demarcation. This is not where we go. I still think that should have been done with Bush. Definitely think that should be done now with Trump. And by the way, I wasn't for the first impeachment. I wasn't for it. I don't typically like the idea of impeachment, especially when I consider it selective justice. This, I don't consider selective, and I do think that we can walk, chew gum at the same time. Now, from your standpoint, am I wrong? Like, do you see the difference between Russiagate and this? And is that difference enough for you to be like, okay, yeah, fair enough. I see where you're coming from with the thing about Donald Trump and saying that this goes too far. Or is it like, well, no, Russiagate and this are pretty much the same, and this should just get a pass? What are your thoughts?
Well, a couple of things. I think that not only did, when you talk about bad faith, right, as an example, Adam Schiff knew that the DNC server assigned...
Garland, I agree with you on that. I agree with 1,000% on Russiagate. Everything you say on Russiagate, I agree. I'm making the point it's irrelevant.
So my point is, so when he knew one thing and said the opposite, and then made an attempt to stop the text from that, I mean, he made an attempt to stop people from finding out and reading what happened in the hearing that would have shown that he was lying. So there were unbelievable number of instances in Russiagate where they absolutely acted in bad faith.
Agree.
When it comes to acting in bad faith, I agree, but I think they were acting in bad faith.
Agree, but Schiff wasn't the president of the United States. And for all of the political leeway that we give to fleece the public, to attack other countries, to be bellicosity and all this other stuff, this seemed to go too far. Schiff wasn't the president. This is not about Russiagate. This is entirely about a president that turned the game board over when he didn't win, meaning he was perfectly willing to play in the game in the first place, and when he won, they gave him power. When he lost, he did everything in his power to keep that power. That is overturning the results of the game itself and turning any notion of representative government or democracy or whatever we have here on its head. That can't be allowed.
Wasn't that within his rights? Wasn't that something that he, as a president? Yes. I mean, that's the kind of thing that he can do.
Yes.
He can't. Well, but when did it stop? Was it? Because here's the thing.
It stopped when he got to
you and I have both. You and I have both made fun of Sidney Powell and others, and Giuliani, for bringing up the ghost of Hugo Chavez and the Dominion. But we both criticized them on that. But I have heard that there are other more valid complaints that could have been addressed. Now, admittedly, Trump wasn't bringing those up. He was backing Powell until he and Giuliani threw under the bus, and he was backing the Dominion voting systems argument. That's ridiculous, and a lot of people are getting sued over that. But I guess just to follow up on this, when did he lose that right?
He lost that right when it became very clear that it was bad faith. Meaning when Donald, because think about it for the moment. Look, you can criticize me on this channel. My position has been very clear. On the Russiagate stuff, it was bogus. We were absolutely against that impeachment. When Donald Trump first came out and said, we want to check the polls and all this other stuff, I was all for it. You were right here with me, completely for it. Yes, the president has the ability to do that. They shouldn't criticize him for it. It is his right. If there is an election that is being stolen, we as Americans need to know it. It's a big deal. But at the point where your lawsuits fail, at the point where the argument gets so ridiculous, where you're talking about the ghost of Hugo Chavez, then good faith arguments come into play on whether or not the president actually believes it, or even more importantly, and more apropos, should he believe it, if there's nothing there to back it up. And I'm saying he had bupkis, and he still pushed this stuff. That's my issue with this. It's not that Trump made the claim. It's the Trump that Trump couldn't substantiate the claim and still pushed it nonetheless, regardless of how ridiculous it sounds. Well, let's do this. Let's take a break because we're on it's a debate. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us for what's been a pretty spirited debate is Garland Nixon, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. Garland, I ended that comment. I ended that segment. So I want you to give your commentary as a response before moving on to the issues of Neera Tanden and the roasting that she basically received from the Senate.
Well, a couple of things. I think you can, and this is one of the things that I see goes on in this conversation. We can discuss how all of the things Donald Trump said were absurd, were wrong, were ridiculous. We can discuss what happened. You know, people talk about what happened on January 6th. Okay, all of these things happened, unthinkable things that you would prefer not to happen. People lost their lives. But at some point, you have to get from what Donald Trump did and said to that January 6th. You have to show that what he did and said caused that, created that. I don't know if you have to show criminal intent or not necessarily, but at least show that it caused that. See, that's where I can't get to. I can't get from Donald Trump said this and that caused it in a way that causes me to say, I don't want that speech to be protected. When I read the January 6th speech, I say, well, it ain't in that as far as I'm concerned. I don't see anywhere in there where this is where he said something that would have implied that people should use some kind of violence. It's particularly when he says we're going to walk peacefully and patriotically over to the Capitol. And the only thing he says other than that is we're going to fight like hell, which is a very commonly used phrase in politics. I've used it. Yeah. We've all used it. Fight like hell to stop or change or whatever. So agreed. I think my issue is this. It's like the domestic terrorism laws. It's like what Ron DeSantis was trying to do. When they say, well, Garland, if you call for a protest and people start protesting, but if anything happens bad at that protest, if one person gets hurt, if one bottle gets thrown at the police, you're going to go to jail. I got a problem with that. And if you say, when we look at all the things Donald Trump has said, even though he didn't say do it, even though he didn't apply you should do it, if just from his words we can say, because you said that it happened, there's a short jump to if Garland Nixon and Jamal Thomas and Shane Stranahan says, let's have a protest and we got to fight like hell for fill in the blank.
That's not the standard that I'm putting. That's not my standard. That's not the standard. I mean, yeah, Donald Trump says something, but that's not, again, what I am indicting him on. I am indicting him on where it was perfectly reasonable. If I am in a crowded theater and I scream fire, somebody gets hurt. I don't say, or I can't say, well, look, I didn't tell them to go run into the door. I can't tell them that. No, they're going to say, well, dude, you did something that is infinitely foreseeable to have consequences of people potentially being hurt on the way out the door. I look at it through those lenses. If Donald Trump was honest or earnest or had any good faith belief at all, I would give him the benefit of the doubt in saying he has a right to do this. But that's not what I'm indicting him on one speech. I'm indicting him on his behavior for the entire time after he lost that race, especially from the point where he realized he had fundamentally lost. But we are no arguments. Shane, do you want to add in before we move on?
I do. I want to add in two things. For one thing, I see your Oliver Wendell Holmes. I believe he was the originator of that idea. Yelling fire in a crowded theater. I see us yelling theater in a crowded fire. I see this the whole impeachment as largely a public spectacle, sort of like the Roman Colosseum and the games, where despite the conflagration, despite the decline of our political system, we're wasting our freaking time on this. I don't see Donald Trump, and again, in my opinion, buried himself politically by the way that he handled not just the COVID crisis, not just in general aspects of his presidency, his administration, staff bungling, constantly firing people, making himself untenable as a political leader in the future because he constantly threw people around him under the bus. And then he doubled down in the final days of his presidency with what happened on January 6th and on January 7th, with what he said in that couple of day period. He damned himself. So I see this as a waste of time, and we're talking about it because it is important, but in some sense, it's also a distraction from what should be an attempt to bring our country back from the brink of serious economic decline, and while we're still in the middle of a major pandemic. And another side of this, and this is really going to throw gasoline on the fire, admittedly, but it's ridiculous. Again, coming back to this, if Trump can be held liable for what his followers did on January 6th, for saying something that, while in itself is not technically illegal, but that it, can be considered implicitly as incitement, whatever, again, even though he said the word peaceful. What about last summer? What about when Democratic leaders across the nation were admittedly sort of hedging their bets, backing up the protests, all that stuff? Isn't that, there was more violence during those protests than there was on January 6th, admittedly of a smaller political caliber. It wasn't the Capitol building, but still, shouldn't they be held liable? Now, they aren't the president, but still, Jamarl, Garland, what are your takes?
They're not the president, but also they're like mayors and governors or whatnot. And there's a difference between, those weren't Democratic, they weren't out there for Democrats. Those people were out there because they were pissed off about things that were taking place from either the cops or maybe issues of poverty or those type of things. It wasn't a crowd brought out by various political leaders to go out and do X or Y. The crowd was acting and functioning on their own. So again, there's a difference in those things to me.
Garland, what do you think?
I argue that no, that they shouldn't have. That what the people were saying was protected speech, and I argued. I think that your analogy in comparison is fairly accurate, and that's again my issue that. I think what Donald Trump said on January 6th was protected speech. I think if you read the particular articles of impeachment, they bring up the thing about Georgia. Right? They bring up the January 6th. They bring up the January 6th statement. They bring up the thing about that he said about the AG in Georgia, and they bring up the fact that he kept saying that the election was fraudulent. Those are the three things that they hit in the impeachment trial. And you got to be really careful when you start setting precedents for what someone said that actually leads to inciting violence. Because man, I'm with you there, Shane. As soon as I say we got to get out and fight like hell to get Medicare for all, and some guy gets bopped in the head during that protest, they're going to come lock me up. And say, that sets us up for the selective application of justice. I hear what you're saying on that. I didn't mean to cut in too hard there, Garland, but I hear what you're saying absolutely. Anyway, we've only got a couple of minutes, Jamarl. You want to move on to Neera?
Well, like I said, selective justice is not justice. And I've made that argument on more than one occasion. And so while I agree with maybe 90% of the stuff that you guys are saying, I come to a radically different conclusion. And I come to that conclusion because I believe it's for the sake of the nation. You can say it's a waste of time. You can make an argument that any impeachment is a waste of time. And I even accept the arguments that you guys are making from the standpoint of Russiagate was a way of delegitimizing Trump when he took office. Fair enough. But look, there's a difference. He jumped the shark, and that's on him. And from my standpoint, I look at what George Bush did. I look at some of the actions that presidents took in the past from the standpoint of military, and I still make the point that if those presidents or that president was impeached, it would set a precedent to not do that going forward. And by allowing Trump to pass on this, I think, look, I get it. Our point of view is somewhat skewed. It's almost like having an alcoholic grandfather that curses and is belligerent, and so you kind of grow up with a screwed up skewed in regards to what addiction is. Unless the person is falling out, cursing, screaming, and fighting the cops, it's not addiction. Well, no. Yes, our perspective of this stuff is kind of warped, but my head is on right on this. Democracy is fragile, and I'm not about jostling it with the likes of Trump. And no, I don't want to do it either with Democrats. Let's do this. We have about 2 minutes. I want to talk about Neera Tanden real quick. That is a cantankerous woman. And she is being put up for Joe Biden's Office of Budget and Management, or Management and Budget, OMB, I believe, Management and Budget. What do you have to say about that? I mean, she initially said that Libya should pay for the fact that America bombed and destroyed Libya. She's had all of these comments about people on the left, not to mention tweets about Republicans, but it goes beyond that. Attacking Sanders' campaign minister or campaign person when she was working at Center for American Progress, and he asked a question about Hillary Clinton that she didn't particularly like because it made Hillary Clinton look bad. This woman is horrific, but she's going to be in Biden's administration. What do you have to say about that? We have about 2 minutes.
I couldn't find a more perfect representation of Joe Biden's policies than Neera Tanden. That's what I have to say. In the same way that people said Donald Trump is a madman, blah, 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 I said I couldn't find a better representation for the last couple centuries of American policies than Donald Trump. particularly foreign policies, but to some extent domestic policies. And Neera Tanden, she despises progressives. That's the Democratic Party now. She's a warmonger. She's, that's the Democratic Party now. To me, people are like, oh my gosh, she's terrible. No, she's not an outlier. Bernie Sanders, well, he's not a Democrat, but people like that are outliers, people who aren't so much pro-war. Bernie's still a little bit too much empire for me. So I think that you should hold her up and say, hey, she's closer to Joe Biden than hardly anybody we know. As sad as that is, if you look at the policies of Biden since he's been here, if you look at his history, Joe Biden is like Neera Tanden is a angry, cantankerous one of Joe Biden's policies. She's perfect.
Absolutely perfect. Absolutely perfect. Like you said, she's a perfect representation of the party. She's not an outlier. Perfect. The voice that you guys were listening to, Garland Nixon, friend of the show, Sputnik political analyst and co-host of the Critical Hour and Critical Hour Extended, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik. You can follow Garland's work as the host of the Critical Hour right here on Radio Sputnik. Also on Facebook and on YouTube. Garland, you've been doing a lot of shows on YouTube. Please plug yourself. Okay, well, you can find Garland on YouTube, Facebook, and at this point, Twitter. He's been doing a lot of live streams. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for our last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, events, and more across our country, as well as across the surface of our increasingly fragmented globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means that together, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get back into the headlines this morning. First up, in COVID news, at least 3,167 new coronavirus deaths and 96,460 new cases of COVID were reported in the United States yesterday, February 9th. Over the past week, there has been an average of 108,144 cases per day, a decrease of 35% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 27,233,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. Just over 468,000 have died from it. And I've got to say, again, this is the third day in a row that we have had less than 100,000 new cases in the U.S. Things are still pretty damn grim. If you compare this to last summer, let alone the early days of the virus in spring last year, we're still up there. Almost 100,000 cases, new cases of COVID per day is still high. But, we've been going down. And so looking at it from a rate perspective, it's good to see that rate dropping. In Chicago, teachers have approved a COVID-19 safety deal that paves the way for students to begin returning to classrooms. The vote appears to end a long and bitter dispute between the Chicago Teachers Union on one side and Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the nation's third largest public school system on the other. The teachers union said early Wednesday that 67% of the roughly 20,000 members who cast ballots electronically had opted to accept the agreement. More than 25,000 were eligible to vote. The terms include more teacher vaccinations and guidelines for closing schools if there's a spike in COVID cases. Pre-kindergarten and special education students whose parents chose to have them return or limited in-person learning can come back Thursday. Elementary school students can return March 1st and middle schoolers on March 8th. No plans were as yet announced for high school students. At least 36 people may have developed a rare blood disorder known as immune thrombocytopenia, ITP, after taking either Pfizer and BioNTech or Moderna's COVID-19 vaccines. This according to a report submitted to VAERS, the government's vaccine adverse event reporting system. The condition develops when the immune system attacks platelets, a blood component essential for clotting, or the cells that create them for unknown reasons. Jamarl, you said you wanted to talk about this in the last hour. Anything you wanted to bring up this time around?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to talk about it from the standpoint of the medical part. I mean, oftentimes we hear people, look, we tend to be on a part of the sandbox where we have these conversations and arguments. And some of these conversations mainstream media would never have. And we step into the lines pit to have these conversations. One of these was on the vaccine. And you have some people saying that the vaccine murdered Hank Aaron or the vaccine killed X or Y. And so they would point out and say, hey, there are consequences to taking the vaccine. Well, with this, my concern, even if it may necessarily be a reality to it, they would point to this. And they would say, see, there's a consequence for the virus or there's a consequence for the vaccine. And I think the honest thing is, well, yeah, anything that you do may have a consequence. The question is, what is the level of consequence compared to the good that it does? Meaning you can drink too much water and die. There's all sorts of things you could do that may have a negative impact on you that also may have positive benefits at other times. When you have nearly 500,000 people dead, the effect of this would have to be severe and extreme for the vaccine rollout to be in any way inhibited by it. And I doubt it will be, nor do I doubt if it's sufficient to do so. But I will be totally open to having the doctors on, to kind of having this conversation about the reality of this. Because I do think we need to get to the nub of it, not necessarily the optics of it. And I don't want this to be used as a thing of saying, see, we told you that this virus is extra way. So,
yeah, and that I'm sure is a concern among many. The problem is if it doesn't get reported and they say that there's a media blackout on it, but it's ridiculous. A couple dozen people. I've just checked for myself. I'm not trying to set you up for something, but have you been following the total number of vaccines administered? And if you have, or if you haven't, what would you guess in the U.S. how many doses of COVID vaccines have been administered so far?
It's been millions at this point, I would imagine. I mean, it has to be millions at this point. Even with the busted rollout, you had multiple states.
44.4 million.
Yeah. So
44. Yeah.
And we're talking about like 10 people or 20 people.
It's 30-something people. Yeah. So here's where I would go with this. You've many tens of millions, 44.4 million as of today. As of yesterday. That's a lot of doses administered. And the ratio of people who suffered some traumatic effects to that total number seems pretty low. That's, again, just to support what you're saying, but still, you report it, you talk about it a little bit. Ghana's parliament has been suspended for at least 3 weeks following a surge in COVID-19 cases among parliament members and staff. Speaker Alban Bagbin announced the suspension late Tuesday, saying that at least 17 members of parliament and 151 staffers have tested positive for the coronavirus. He has urged lawmakers and other parliament staffers to get tested. Any traveler who visits England from a red list country faces steep fines and a possible 10-year prison sentence, according to Britain's Health Secretary Matt Hancock. This under a new policy that came into effect earlier this week on Monday. There are 33 countries on that red list, including South Africa, Portugal, and all of South America, from where travel to England has effectively been banned, largely because of concerns over new variants of the coronavirus. And this, of course, as the UK has its own new variant spreading too. The Wisconsin pharmacist accused of intentionally attempting to destroy nearly 500 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine formally pled guilty in federal court on Tuesday. Prosecutors charged Stephen Brandenburg, 46 years old, with 2 counts of attempting to tamper with consumer products. The charges carry a maximum combined sentence of 20 years in prison and $500,000 in fines. And by the way, earlier on, you were asking about why he did that, why he attempted to destroy the vaccines. Well, apparently, he's a flat earther and believes that vaccines are, quote, of the devil, end quote.
Are you serious?
And apparently, yes.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. Yep. And he brought guns in a suitcase to his job at the healthcare facility where he worked. So there you go.
Do you know how weird that is? So I was listening to, and we haven't been able to bring somebody on for this, but the video, that UFO video with Bob Bigelow. Bob Bigelow was the guy at the center of ATIP. Now, Luis Elizondo, who was part of the ATIP program, he was only part of a small part. Bob Bigelow was part of a much larger program to study this stuff. What Bigelow said, or what Luis Elizondo said, was that there are elements in the government, the reason why the information haven't been coming out, let's say, even more than what it has been is because there are military leaders in the government that believe in what is Ephesians something, talking about the devil in the sky, that UFOs and beings outside of this earth are demonic. And because they're demonic, they're trying to basically close the issue for it to not exist. Not that they doubt that the issue exists, more so that they don't even want to deal with it because they believe it's satanic. This is oh God, man. Like, talk about scientific progress being held back for this nonsense. That's aggravating to me. That's so aggravating.
That's good to hear. That's heartening to hear about our government. No, I'm kidding. Of course, this is ridiculous. I hadn't heard that. We should come back to that at some point. In national political news, a divided U.S. Senate voted largely along party lines yesterday to move ahead with Donald Trump's impeachment trial and a charge of inciting the deadly assault on the Capitol. The Senate voted 56-44 to proceed to the first ever trial of a former president, rejecting his defense lawyer's argument that Trump was beyond the reach of the Senate after having left the White House on January 20th. And apparently, former President Trump was furious and beyond angry over his defense team's showing on day one of his second impeachment trial, despite his ultimate acquittal being almost certain, with not nearly enough Republicans going to vote. They would need a 2/3 majority, 66 votes. I misspoke earlier and said 60, I realize. Anyway, they would need a majority. They're not going to get it. Not enough Republicans are switching sides on this one. Trump's attorney, Bruce Castor, gave a rambling 45-minute opening argument, including praising the House impeachment managers for a job well done, quote unquote, well done. Trump watched the proceedings from his quarters in Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. And I can get why he's furious, because, of course, what he wanted to talk about was election fraud. He didn't want his legal team to try to cozy up to Congress. He wanted to push back on them vociferously. And, maybe he could have if he chosen to testify, although that probably would have gotten suppressed. They probably would have pushed back on that pretty hard as being irrelevant. But, hey, he might have had the chance. I don't know. Nevertheless, he decided to testify either before or during the trial. Minutes into her confirmation hearing, President Biden's nominee for director of the White House Office of Management and the Budget, Neera Tanden, had to address concerns over hostile tweets she has posted against various Republican lawmakers. The first Republican on the Senate Homeland Security Committee to question Tanden, Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, immediately brought up Tanden's posts, many of which she deleted late last year. Neera Tanden apologized and told senators Tuesday that she deleted more than 1,000 tweets in November because I regretted my tone, quote unquote, and that nobody advised me at all, quote unquote, to scrub the social media account of harsh comments ahead of her nomination. I see you adding this one now, Jamal, that the Biden administration plans to continue to seek extradition of Julian Assange of WikiLeaks. I see you adding this now. Want to quickly comment on that one?
Yeah, it's being reported by Reuters, basically, that Biden is going to continue to go after Julian Assange. I just wanted to put it in because it is a big deal. It was trending. And basically, President Joe Biden administration plans to continue to seek extradite WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange from the United Kingdom to the United States to face hacking conspiracy charges, the U.S. Justice Department said. And again, this is being reported by Reuters. Look, Obama was greatly concerned about what this would do to the issue of media. Because if you go after Assange, then Chuck Todd, Rachel Maddow, Jake Tapper, and all of these other people who may, on some random occasion, come out with a story that the government doesn't like, it makes them fair game. Obama understood it, which is why he wasn't going after Julian Assange. Biden doesn't seem to have that discretion. And not to mention he has a party of hyenas that are believing that Assange has something to do with Hillary Clinton losing the race. And so many of them basically, scream this nonsense, despite having necessarily nothing there for it. And each plank of the Russiagate thing being utterly destroyed as it went along. That doesn't matter. You have a lot of conspiracy theorists, and they want him.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
It turned Democrats against him. And that's one of the sad consequences of Russiagate, but that was perpetrated by Democrats in the media. And then Trump tried to extort him, basically, saying that, if you doing a quid pro quo thing where if you tell me who leaked stuff to you, I'll grant you freedom. I view that as extortion. Anyway, we got to move on. A lot more headlines to get to. Gregory Ulrich, the 67-year-old man accused of killing one person and wounding 4 others during the Tuesday morning shooting at the Alena Healthcare Clinic in the Minnesota city of Buffalo, was very familiar to law enforcement and was upset with his treatment there. He has been taken into custody. Buffalo Police Chief Pat Boudke said that most likely the shooting was targeted at that facility or someone within that facility, given the suspect's history of conflict. The center released a statement saying that for both patients and staff, the shooting at the healthcare center that killed one person and wounded 4 others has been traumatic. In international news, a special tribunal in Bangladesh's capital on Wednesday sentenced to death 8 Islamic militants for the 2015 killing of a publisher of books on secularism and atheism. In Poland, independent media has suspended news coverage, and the web pages of the country's leading news organizations were left blank Wednesday morning as a protest against a new advertising tax that many say would restrict free speech. France's government wants to set the age of sexual consent at 15 and make it easier to punish long-ago child sexual abuse amid growing public pressure and a wave of online testimonies about rape and other sexual violence by parents and authority figures. In France, also, politicians, prominent intellectuals, and academics have voiced concern that, quote, out-of-control leftism and cancel culture, end quote, from the United States is threatening French identity. They are arguing that American ideas on race, gender, post-colonialism, especially those coming from U.S. universities, are undermining French society and are an attack on French heritage. The collection of intellectuals arguing that France is being contaminated by the leftism of America was buoyed last October, after French President Emmanuel Macron appeared to side with them. The European Commission's president, Ursula von der Leyen, has said she deeply regrets the EU's threat to revoke Article 16 in its spat with Ireland and the UK. As the union deals with a vaccine crisis spurred by what some are calling vaccine nationalism, European Union leaders threatened to reimpose controls on the border between Northern Ireland and Ireland after requesting vaccine distributions from Northern Ireland, even though the region is part of the Brexit customs union. Von der Leyen admitted that mistakes were made in the negotiations, also criticized the union's vaccine approval and procurement process so far, saying they were late with the approval, too optimistic in mass production, and also too certain that orders of vaccines would be delivered on time. In Earth and Science news, there's a polar vortex on the U.S.-Canada border with temperatures as low as 43 degrees below zero in northern Minnesota. Ahead of this Arctic blast, there will be a series of winter storms along the collision zone of cold and warm air, bringing ice from Texas to Tennessee and significant snow to Washington, D.C. And in business news, Dutch beer brewer Heineken said Wednesday it plans to cut 8,000 staff, that's nearly 10% of its global workforce, as part of a cost-cutting reorganization after a pandemic-dominated year that saw it sink to a net loss of 204 million euros, that's $248 million. With bars and pubs around the world closed during COVID lockdowns and alcohol bans in some markets, Heineken sold 8% less beer than in 2019. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in just a minute talking with Caleb Maupin about woke washing, cancel culture, and the left's intellectual influence abroad on the other side of this break. Be back in just a minute with Caleb Maupin.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today. Get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and digs straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're talking cancel culture between prominent American journalists and a wave of French academics. There's been a strong push against cancel culture and woke isolationism this week. Let's start with Glenn Greenwald in the conversation about journalism. Glenn Greenwald recently slammed, quote, junior high hall monitor tattling and Stasi-like citizen surveillance, end quote, at CNN, NBC, and the New York Times, whose reporters, he says, engage in character-assassinating, censorship-fostering games. He named names: Brian Stelter and Oliver Darcy at CNN, Ben Collins and Brandy Zadrozny at NBC, and Mike Isaac, Kevin Roos, and Shira Frankel at the Times. He sent this due to a recent exchange on Twitter by New York Times reporter Taylor Lorenz at the Times again, who falsely accused investor Mark Andreessen of using the word retarded, a derogatory slur clearly. On this point, Greenwald criticized Hall Monitor reporters who repeatedly attempted to shame social media platforms into deplatforming those who don't toe the journalistic line. This reminds me of back in 2014 when New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet said his organization deserved the hit for creating a priesthood that decided who was a journalist and who was not. That's a quote, creating an isolated and self-perpetuating media class. And again, he used the word priesthood there. He confirmed that outlook. To talk about this, we are joined by speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author Caleb Maupin. Caleb, thanks so much for joining us, and let's talk about journalism. America's journalistic class regularly neglects deeper crimes than an investor using a slur, whether it's the truth about our proxy wars overseas or the Greek chorus of support for Russiagate. Caleb, what's your take? Is the journalistic class guilty of woke washing?
Well, I think that cancel culture, in a lot of ways, represents a kind of immaturity, a kind of inability to engage with ideas in a deep way. And it kind of gives people who often have nothing better to do and no real ability to feel powerful or important, it gives them some kind of a feeling that they are accomplishing something, that they can keep track of who is breaking the rules this week, if they can criticize someone on the internet, if they can follow someone around on the internet, if they can, stalk somebody on the internet, cause them to lose their job or something. They feel special or something. But at the end of the day, not much is really accomplished by it. And it's kind of a tragedy of the times we are living in. And it gives people kind of a cathartic release. It makes people feel like they are somehow, releasing pent-up rage. But at the end of the day, not much is really accomplished. And it leads to kind of a lowering of the level of discourse where ideas don't seem to matter. It just kind of matters if you can keep track of a list of who has broken what rules and call them out for it. It's kind of sad.
A dumbing down of the conversation, that people can't say what they want to say in order to get a point across. Because you have other people who would say, oh, that word is inappropriate. That thought is inappropriate. Or you shouldn't say X or Y. And by the way, that doesn't even go to the level of, somebody saying, hey, let's go kill Bob. Like, it's not even there. It's in these kind of weird subjective states where they don't give the benefit of the doubt in trying to have the conversation, because having the conversation would basically mean that they have to defend a position that they may not necessarily want to defend. The cancel culture thing is horrific. And it's one of those things that seems to be more endemic on the left. I've seen the attacks on you, for God's sake. You go in to have a conversation, and these guys are calling you a fascist, despite the fact that they don't even understand what the definition means. It's utterly astonishing. So please talk about it. I've seen you defending yourself on YouTube. I've even seen you have conversations with people who were literal fascists, trying to make the point that says, look, there's a difference between me and the policies that I'm talking about, which I'm very clear about, and this guy. Or for that matter, I've seen you have these conversations. So definitely, please talk about it.
Well, it's quite interesting, and thank you for bringing it up. But, whenever I go anywhere on the internet or I go on a show or anything, inevitably there will be a follow-up of people who will tweet at whatever show I'm on or post on whatever internet web forum I'm on. And the attacks will not have any substance. It'll be Caleb talks to this person, or Caleb one time said something that we consider to be not in line with the overall views of the trans movement. And it'll be are these people engaging with what I have to say? Is there anything, do the people who post this even know what they're even talking about? And it's kind of bizarre. And again, you have to wonder, do these people feel like they're accomplishing anything by doing this? Have they achieved anything? And I don't really care, and I keep going, and I don't really seem to mind. And those who listen to me and listen to what I have to say, it's pretty obvious I'm not on the right. It's pretty obvious I'm not an advocate of fascism or racism or oppression of transgender people or any other grouping of people. But it's kind of weird. A lot of times the people doing this, you look into what they seem to be about, and there's a very surface level understanding of politics, but there is a very, very strong desire to feel somehow important. Like by exposing me, in a tweet, they've accomplished something, but have they really accomplished anything?
No, it's just like a personal vindication of, some kind of theatrics that these guys are virtue signaling. And yeah, it does deaden the conversation that needs to take place. Like, for example, right now, we're in a situation with the number of people who are being thrown out. We have the number of people who are ill. The vaccines are trying to be rolled. Like, there are like 30, 40 different things that are basically on the marquee of importance. And some of those things require conversations, and some of those conversations are uncomfortable. The fighting the trans. Tulsi Gabbard, for example, tries to push the bill that says trans men should not be able to fight in rings with women, something to that effect. And when people make the point of saying, well, wait, maybe there's a reality to that if the person transitions, that, yeah, it's fine. I have no issue with saying that person is a woman. By the same token, if the bone and muscle structure are in a way that is going to damage the opposition, then yes, I have issue with that. And maybe we should talk about it. Well, at that point, they'll say, I'm anti-trans for bringing that up. That's not anti-trans at all. That's having an honest argument about real-world phenomena where my ideology doesn't necessarily succeed reality. But please discuss. You hit these things also. It is very strange. It's like these are conversations that should be had, and yet off the table.
Well, it's the trans issue is particularly interesting because, if I were to right now completely derail this interview and just make the most eloquent trans rights speech, and it was nothing but the most eloquent, strongest argument in favor of trans rights, immediately I can guarantee you that my inbox, my direct messages would be full of people cursing me out because inevitably at some point in that trans rights speech, I would have said something incorrect. I would have advocated for the rights of trans people in the wrong way somehow. And that particular issue, you cannot say anything about that issue at all. There is no safe way to discuss it. No matter what you say, and there are so many different interpretations of that issue, you have to understand that even within the trans community itself, there is not universal agreement about what exactly is the right thing to do or say. And that you'll notice that the people that often become victims of the cancel culture of the trans movement tend to be often transgender people themselves. Natalie Wynn, also known as ContraPoints, who's an outspoken transgender YouTube activist, she has been targeted viciously, by other trans people for all kinds of violations and offenses with her YouTube channel. And it seems like that issue in particular, you really just cannot say anything about it in a safe way. No matter what you say about the trans issue, no matter how sensitive you are, no matter how supportive you are, no matter what, you will inevitably earn the wrath of a lot of people. And the wrath is not, well, sir, I think you said this the wrong way. The wrath is you are evil. You're the reason people commit suicide. You're a hate monger. It is a really vicious wrath you will earn. And it is impossible to talk about the issue without not earning that wrath. And I've noticed that in particular on the internet, and it's quite interesting.
Well, and okay, so let's come back to Glenn Greenwald for a second, because this ties in pretty much perfectly to the conversation. I'm just to quickly bring this up. I'm also a fan of Natalie Wynn. I disagree with her on politics in some ways, but ContraPoints, great channel. She does a very good job over there. But back to Glenn Greenwald, he had this Twitter thread back on February 4th that I just found. Just managed to actually get it. I'm going to quote directly from one of his tweets. He's talking about exactly this issue. Quote, if you have a political movement whose goal is to try to obtain power to improve society, you'll naturally try to expand those who identify with your movement and feel part of it. If the goal is a lifestyle brand to feel special, you'll want to expel and make it as small as possible, end quote. And it seems to me that we're seeing the second more and more on the left and in our society. For all the conversations about political polarization and how to depolarize society, well, it seems like one of the most significant ways in which our society is polarized is you have these increasingly isolated, sort of woke isolationist groups of people who engage in cancel culture, the whole virtue signaling thing, purity testing, people who are on the fringes and could be considered as in alignment with them. We see this in our politics, and we see this in our culture at large. I'll put it on this, and I want to hear your take on it. I think this started in academia and in journalism, and spread quickly from academia to journalism. I think that part of what's going on here is you have overcompetition. You have intense competition between academics and, of course, between journalists. And they're using the cultural tools they have access to in order to basically close ranks, close file, using it politically as a tool against their opponents. In other words, there is an ideological component to this with its own history and its own consequences. But I also see that as a sort of purely political phenomena where there's a power grab between people in institutions where they have increasingly scarce access to resources. Does that make sense, Caleb? What's your take on that?
Well, I think that you can go a little bit further with that, and that in a lot of ways, academia has become really influential in left-wing circles because the labor movement, which used to be the basis of the left, right? It used to be labor unions. That was the basis of left-wing organizing, especially go back to the 1930s. Labor unions have gotten weaker and weaker and weaker. And instead, academia is where leftists, Marxists, socialists, that's where they find employment. And so increasingly in left-wing circles, things are framed in an academic way. And if you look at the way academic funding and research grants are handed out, you can get a grant from the Rockefeller Foundations to study gender oppression. You can get a grant from the Ford Foundation to write a book about, the role of racism and the way Hollywood portrays ethnic minorities. But you will not get a grant for your research if you're going to be talking about the need for capitalism to be overturned and engaging in kind of a class struggle way, and that through the academic fields in which people, professors need to get their research funded. Publishers, they need to get distribution for their published works, and that there has been a nudging of left-wing circles away from class struggle politics and more towards politics around identity, critiquing art and culture in particular. You can talk about the Congress for Cultural Freedom program that the CIA set up during the 1950s. You can talk about all kinds of efforts by the U.S. government in particular to covertly push left-wing politics and left-wing academia and left-wing artists and intellectuals in a certain way. And I think all of this has been done in a lot of ways to push people away from any kind of economic struggle, to make the issue about identity, to make the issue about critiquing art and culture. You talk about the Frankfurt School and Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and, the voices that came to dominate left-wing politics during the 1960s, the so-called New Left. Is very much an entity that is focused on the one hand, critiquing art and culture and emphasizing identity, but on the other hand, giving people permission to release their impulses. Sigmund Freud wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, arguing that all civilizations, to some degree, encourage people to restrain their impulses around aggression and their impulses around sexuality. And that renegotiating the restraints on human impulses tends to be the political struggles of our time. As civilizations clash, as revolutions take place, a lot of this is a renegotiation of those restraints on our impulses. And that it is an effective way of gaining power by giving people permission to unleash impulses that they had previously been taught to restrain. That is a way that a rising force can gain power. And like you talk about,
you're talking about the 60s, in part at least.
Yeah,
and I mean,
we need
to go into a break. Yes, I hear you. We need to go into a break. And of course, if you start to talk too much about class, these folks will accuse you of class reductionism. It just, as somebody who I don't identify with the political left. I like some of their ideas, but I'm pretty across the board in different ways. It seems ridiculous and internecine and self-destructive to me. But hey, I don't know what I can do about it. Regardless, we've got to go into a break. We'll be back in a minute. We're joined by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Be back to continue this conversation with Caleb in just a minute.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. Let's talk about France for a minute, and then I'll come back to the United States. Last October, French President Emmanuel Macron criticized certain, I'm quoting here, certain social science theories entirely imported from the United States, end quote. His education minister said there was a battle to wage against an intellectual matrix from American universities. That was also last October. But in the last since then, in the last week specifically, there's been an ongoing and growing public conversation in France about these American intellectual exports as a thing in themselves, as a thing to push back against, basically. And I can see where that comes in. In some sense, these are a massive ideological and cultural export. They're an extension of certain tendencies of American imperialism. I will say that. And it's a weird kind of ideological colonization process that increasingly a lot of folks in other countries are responding to. Does that make any sense to you, Caleb? What's your take on that? Does that fit? I mean, you were talking about the origins of this stuff. You were talking about it as being a U.S.-backed and intentionally funded movement to destabilize society in some sense. Do you see this internationally as a foreign policy component? What's your take on that idea, Caleb?
I think you're absolutely right. And that you have to remember, France has a very, very proud history and tradition of intellectualism and of political engagement going back to the French Revolution. I mean, you listen to the French national anthem, and that a lot of French people very much are proud of their history as a country. And that pride is wrapped up in their tradition of revolutionary politics, their tradition of engaging with political ideas. They see themselves as kind of the vanguard of Western Europe when it comes to new ideas, challenging the status quo. And that's very much part of the French identity. And so I can understand why they would feel threatened by the cancel culture and such that we see here in the United States, and argue that this is, in a way, an attack on something that they very much identify with as a big part of their heritage. What I think is also interesting is that, if you go back to the Cold War, it's important to dig up, look up the term Euro-communist. What is a Euro-communist? Well, that was in 1978. The French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, and the Spanish Communist Party all cut their ties to the Soviet Union and officially, cut their ties to the Soviet Union, were no longer pro-Soviet. And that was really the result of a lot of covert efforts by American intelligence, particularly to manipulate academia among European leftists, right? And it was through programs, like I mentioned, like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and it was a way to subtly nudge the communist parties of Europe further away from the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union having an alliance with these communist parties throughout the world was very important. And so, the fact that there was efforts through, giving grant money, through supporting different intellectual voices, that ultimately culminated in major communist parties. The French Communist Party, even today, has millions of members. I mean, this is not a small fringe organization. But having these massive communist parties in Italy, in Spain, and in France, breaking ties with the Soviet Union, that was a huge achievement for American intelligence. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the foreign policy advisor, the national security advisor to Jimmy Carter, he particularly bragged about that achievement. And he's the one who coined the term Euro-communist. And that was a huge, huge effort by American intelligence to kind of weaken the influence of the Soviet Union in left-wing circles. What's particularly interesting is that was 1978. And if you look at it, Hollywood was kind of in a left-wing mode at that point. I mean, if you look at the movies that were coming out in that time, I mean, Hollywood was very much pandering to leftists, but also subtly trying to nudge leftists away from the Soviet Union. And it's kind of interesting. You think about, the fact that Hollywood seemed to almost be cooperating in this effort. It's quite fascinating to think about what was going on at this time when the communist movement globally was huge, but it was fracturing. And the foreign policy of the United States seemed to focus on manipulating communists against each other rather than directly opposing communism, as had long been the policy of the Cold War.
We know for the longest time, they thought Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, they thought civil rights leaders were basically communists and that they were being under the auspices of the Soviet Union, like utterly out there stuff. Even from the standpoint of fighting for civil rights, let's say in South America, that same argument was used, where they basically said, hey, these people from United Fruit, or under the territory where the United Fruit is basically raping, those people are trying to be communists because, they want healthcare and human rights. It was used as this kind of cudgel. I agree with you that Hollywood was in the bag for that, but I think I don't know if it's that, I think there's probably some kind of CIA effort. I think the problem is a little bit more acute. So Hollywood may take the perspective of identity. I think they do. Now, whether this identity is in line with issues of social, let's say, economic stuff, it's typically not. It's this decapitation of the notion of economics from identity and the raising of identity above everything else and running with that in lieu of the economic reasons for it. Also, to add to it, I think there's a social pressure that takes place just because of our global world. Somebody could be in the middle of Timbuktu and know exactly within a few seconds what takes place on the other side of the world, and not just what takes place, have an opinion on it. So in the same way we have a societal pressure in our government, in our state, in our family, or in our world, well, that becomes that much more acute in the way that countries feel that pressure is pressuring them. Whether it's Saudi Arabia and putting somebody, crucifixion, or whether it's France and their issue saying, hey, these values are intruding upon our identity. Isn't that just social pressure? And isn't that social pressure on some level a positive attribute? When the world can look at something and the world can come to a humanistic point of view that is wrong or that should be changed, even though there are going to be areas like France that basically resent, the impulse, or at the very least the perspective. What are your thoughts? Is this too much accidental, or do you believe no? There is more agency in this in the attempt to try to push these particular values and separate those values from issues of identity. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think if you get back to Glenn Greenwald's comments and the comments of others about the commodification of an identity, I think that really gets to the essence of what's going on here in a lot of ways. And that, it seems like a lot of these folks, they don't really have very deep political ideas, but they do have a list of rules in their head. And if you break one of those rules, you become a bad person. You become an ist, whether it's a racist or a sexist or or you become a transphobe, or you become a fascist, or you become this or that. And they really, really like to enforce this list of rules in their head and yell at people who've broken the list of those rules. But beyond that, they don't really understand politics beyond that. And their identity, it seems like they are very much, they want to very much take pride in their identity. They are the right kind of person. They are not one of those ists. They are not one of these ideological transgressors. They are pure themselves, and they get to call out people who are not pure. And it's a very kind of a shallow way of being. It is, people talk about hall monitors and kindergarten tattling and stuff, and that is kind of what it is. But it kind of takes the place in a lot of places. It's a way to cover for not really having much ideological depth,
yes.
And not really being able to engage deeply about politics beyond that.
Yeah, and that's where world political progress on a sort of more philosophical level, it seems to be stagnant right now. In large part, it seems like we tend to be revisiting older ideas instead of creating new ones, and we're not even at the synthesizing point yet, where we can use older ideas to come up with something new. We're sort of stuck in the past. And I do not want to continue that trend, but I want to come back to what Jamal was talking about here. You were asking, is this intentional? This is an interesting case, and I'm not making this up. You can look this up, and it's completely verified. There is the case of Jackson Pollock and the CIA, where the CIA, seeing that the rise of the socialist realism art school as a sort of competing form of art, wanted to push back against it. And so through a Rockefeller Brothers Fund, they gave the Museum of Modern Art a 5-year grant, a lot of money, basically made Jackson Pollock rich. And Tom Braden, a CIA official, journalist, and one-time director of the Museum of Modern Art, said, I had the quote just a second ago, basically said, we did more through backing Jackson Pollock, through making Jackson Pollock famous, through making him a big political figure. That did more to combat the Soviet Union's influence than 100 speeches by Eisenhower. Again, I'm paraphrasing that gets pretty directly the point across. So there is this, competition is part of it, certainly, but there's this central authoritative process that has happened at the behest and with the direction of the United States government and the CIA in the field of arts. And it wouldn't surprise me at all to see it in the more ideological social science realm of things as well. I want to come back to France for just a moment here and kind of push back on myself. France is saying woke culture is an American export. But as far as I can tell, and going out, I want to hear your take on this, Caleb. France also they were the exponents of Jacques Lacan, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida. They were the experts of their own branch of continental philosophy, mid 20th century continental philosophy that itself influenced the Frankfurt School and what was going on in the United States. How do you see those philosophers? Again, a little bit abstruse for some maybe, but just in our last minute, what's your take on what happened there, Caleb?
Well, I would say that I think that France has a long tradition of philosophers and intellectuals and such. And yes, there were covert efforts by the United States to manipulate that culture in order to serve Cold War aims, in particular to highlight certain voices, and that what happened with the Frankfurt School in Germany and what happened in France with the rise of some of these postmodern thinkers. You can't say that just naturally happened. That there were efforts by American intelligence to try and push back against the huge influence of Marxism in France and in Germany and elsewhere. So there's many layers to it. But yeah, these thinkers would have been there. There's no question. These people would have been there thinking the way they thought and influencing people without American intelligence helping them. But there probably was a covert effort, to really highlight these voices. I mean, not probably, there was. It's well documented. So it's a mixed bag. And that, when that this concept of nudging, right? If you read Cass Sunstein, who was the advisor, to Obama, he talked about how often what the intelligence agencies do is they don't, directly push things. They just kind of nudge things in a certain direction in order to not blatantly appear to be, shoving anything down anyone's throat.
But I think people feel it. We've got to close it out. But I think people feel the political nudging, the ideological nudging, and they don't like it. They resent that more, I would say, because it's more patronizing than direct commandments, although those would be authoritarian. But I don't think that's worked out for the government. I don't think it'll work out in the future. I think there is a backlash building. Now, whether we're going to hear it with social media suppression is another matter of concern, but we only have so much time here. Caleb, thanks for joining us. For those listening, Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in the context of changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. And by the way, you can follow Caleb on Twitter, Caleb Maupin on Twitter, and check out his articles at calebmaupin.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're taking calls on the other side of this break, 202-521-1320. Be back in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
What do we want? News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're now in the wrap segment. We're wrapping up today's show, and that means we're taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that is 202-521-1320. And I believe we have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, I'm going to bring you on. I just want to apologize. Biden's administration has said they're continuing to seek the extradition of Julian Assange. I think we should scratch that one off the list as a sort of marginal cause for optimism that maybe they would have turned to a new page, maybe decided to bring back Assange into the political fold. But I think Democrats damned themselves. They threw themselves under the bus in some sense by throwing Julian Assange under the bus when they made him one of the centers of Russiagate back in 2016. Anyway, Tarif, You're on the line. What's going on, man?
How y'all doing? Good morning. Thanks for taking my call. I got 2 comments before I get there. We got to get the free Julian Assange, first of all. We got to force the Congress and Senate to have debate on him, to change the espionage laws and the other laws dealing with what brought him, what allow the Department of Justice to go after him in the first place. So the Congress and Senate going to have to do it. We have to push them to do it. My first comment is this. Thomas Cantwell, a guy that was arrested at the Capitol for storming the Capitol, him and his little cohorts was having a conversation before January 6th about that. And I shared the article with you. It seemed like he was he was dealing with the FBI, or he was an FBI agent or something back in 2009 and 2010. They said he was part of the Oath Keepers. He said he wasn't, but that's one person that needs to be investigated beyond what's going on with the FBI. It'd probably be good for the Senate or the Congress to question them. And also, my last comment is dealing with Senator Cassidy. My case dealing with my email that I need to show that the water was broken, that was classified or something like that as personal privacy, a piping that's in the ground. What Senator Bill Cassidy, we have to do from Louisiana to try to work with me to get that open so we can share with the other senators on the Veterans Board and the congressmen so we can move forward in investigating Mike Reed DeBakey on Veterans Administration for contaminated water, So that would be good. So,
Tarif, thank you for the call. I'm looking through the article that you sent in. I don't see Caldwell saying he worked with the FBI or the FBI saying they worked with Caldwell. And Caldwell was a guy who was calling for people to breach the Capitol. He was on the ground doing this stuff. Where'd you see that?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. It's in another article. I sent the wrong article, but in the article, I gotta look for it. I think CBS had it or somebody else. I'm sorry, but it seemed like
no worries. No worries. No, I was checking out what you sent. I mean, where some people would take that would be he was an agent provocateur. I think those arguments are ridiculous and they haven't been borne out at all. But I'm not saying you're saying that, but that's from what I've seen. People use that to try to give moral cover to movements they want to defend, and they do it without actually giving any evidence that was taking place. So anyway, that's just my pushback on that one. And with that, calling in a bit earlier this time, we've got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on. How are you doing? What's going on?
What's going on, guys? Real quick, so my nerd radar went off when Jamal brought up the Injustice series. I want to throw out. There's a comic series that I'm subscribed to that I follow called The Department of Truth. It's a pretty cool comic, but it kind of puts a spin on the whole Ministry of Truth and conspiracy theories and things of that nature. So any nerds out there that's into that kind of stuff, check it out. That's from Image Comics. As far as the impeachment thing goes, I completely agree with you, Shane and Garland. And I want to come at it from a different angle. Of course, it's full of crap. I think it's full of crap. And no, he shouldn't be impeached, right? But my thing is, it's a slap in the face to the American public, because consider all the things that these presidents have done in the past. Even this president has done in the past, right? Consider all the failures, all the illegal wars, all the failures of Congress and Senate, and all of these things. And they don't get impeached for that, right? But whenever you go against them, then suddenly we have to run to impeach. So I consider it an insult, to be quite honest with you. No impeachment for Syria, no impeachment for the illegal wars, no impeachment for completely failing us during COVID, none of that stuff for anyone. But you supposedly incited a riot, so that put us in jeopardy. So now we have to impeach you. I think we have to be careful. It's a slippery slope, because if they can take down a president, which is what they are doing, then it's nothing for them to take down a regular person. It's nothing for them to take down the general public who decides they want to go against the government or rise up. So I just think there's a very slippery slope there, and we are like tumbling down it. And I'll leave it there.
Brave, I appreciate that. I do. But the thing is, and I think what you guys keep missing on this, is that this wasn't against Pelosi. This wasn't against AOC or Pence. This was against us. the game that we play, the game that we all agree to. I give my compliance. I will follow the law. We're going to have sovereign power. All of those things are just agreements of a game that we agree to. And within the context of that game, if you win, you can take power. You have a certain amount of leadership for a certain amount of time. And when you lose, you go home. Trump wanted to overturn the game. I get all of the wars, all of the crimes, the fleecing of the American public. I postulated all of that in my argument for this. And I'm making the point that those things matter less. If you're going to turn over the game board, that matters more. Understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that the democratic order that allows those presidents to break those laws, to go after and fleece the public and kill the people abroad and everything else, as bad as that is still under auspices of the game, as grotesque as it is. If Donald Trump or whatever person come after Trump that is more competent decides to flip the game board over because he loses, meaning he engages in it. If he wins, he takes the power. If he loses, he still takes power. I think that is dramatically important and far more dangerous than anything else that you've described from the standpoint of the way presidents behave. So yes, I understand where you're coming from. No, I disagree. A mark needs to be put into the ground that this is too far. Too far.
But what did he do to break the law in that case? Other than recommending his supporters march on Congress, how did he break the law by contesting the results of the election? You say that he was outside of the rules of the game. Yes. What rule did he break specifically?
Bad faith. The issue is bad faith.
But that's not a legal argument. That's not a legal argument. That's not a legal defense.
Look, impeachment is not entirely just a legal process. It is also a political process. If the president of the United States, in good faith, and this is kind of the point I'm making here.
How do you know? How the hell do you know?
I was very clear early on that Donald Trump had every right in the world to contest the election results. Was I not? That changed when he put out the argument about Giuliani, Sidney Powell, the Cubans, the CIA, and all this other nonsense, because it meant that all of his chances were exhausted, and he still pushed an argument that was utterly and entirely bogus, that he knew had no gravity to it, none.
That's a bad argument. That's not necessarily bad faith.
That argument is on point because what that argument does is makes the point that Donald Trump was inciting a crowd. He was inciting the crowd on an argument that he knew was bogus.
Pardon me if I was unclear. I could call your argument bad maybe, but that's not what I was actually doing. I was saying that was a bad argument on his part. But for one thing, how are you going to prove bad faith? What do you mean bad faith? As far as I can tell, he was acting in good faith. I just think it's ridiculous and he made a political shame of himself. But hey, that just means we don't elect him again.
What was ridiculous about it?
When do you think he started to lie?
What was ridiculous about what Trump was saying? What was ridiculous about the CIA, the Cubans, so forth?
Yes, all that stuff, all those specific claims.
That was ridiculous.
But I think they're
doesn't.
I think they're making.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think he's simply a fool. To be simple, I don't think that Trump was an authoritarian, but he was bordering that. But he was an authoritarian without appearing authoritative. He was never an authoritative figure. I never trusted his epistemics. Sometimes I trusted his gut instincts, but even then, it was a pretty hedged trust. I don't think that he was lying. I just think he made a fool of himself and his supporters by choosing to back up bad arguments. Now, that doesn't mean that he was doing it in bad faith. And frankly, presidents are able to and liable to make a fool of themselves. But the way you deal with that is with an election, not with a second impeachment, the first president ever to be impeached twice. Although, of course, he's not the president anymore. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. But still, we got other callers and we should go to them. But Jamal, what do you think?
I should respond to that. If you go to court and the judge asks you a question, and you give a response to the judge, and the judge says, look, that is a ridiculous response. You should have known better as a human being if you had nothing there to back up that particular political opinion that you were wrong. It's not just what Trump entirely believed. It also goes to what he should or should not have believed, especially if it was in his interest to push this nonsense. Not to mention the pushing the political leaders to break the law. All of that stuff is deeply concerning. So I feel you, but we have additional callers. Let's go to Jaden in Annapolis. Everybody disagrees with me on this one. Where are you, Jay?
Hey, how are you today? Can you hear me?
Doing good, my man.
I can hear you. We can hear you absolutely well. Yeah, we're pretty good. We're having fun. How are you doing, Jay?
My question was for Garland, but I couldn't get through. I was in Cambridge during the riots in the 60s. Stokely Carmichael, Rap Brown, Angela Davis led a protest down there and fled to Baltimore before the riot started. Should they, could they, or would they have been charged for inciting a riot?
Me? You're asking?
I think that's for you.
Oh, well, no. It depends on what they're talking about. And again, I don't think there's a valid comparison between individual Americans that are pushing for civil rights issues versus a president that refused to leave and screamed fire in the middle of the Capitol. I think those things are different. I'm sorry, I just do. If I, as a civil rights group, decide to march because you've just killed a child, or for that matter, you killed a person who was laying on the ground, or you're kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes, yes, the crowd has every right to respond, especially when sovereign power is being used in an inappropriate, illegal way. There is nothing wrong with the audience or the crowd doing that. They should do that. Otherwise, there is no pushback against the 1,000 killings that take place a year with 1% of cops prosecuted. If you're going to compare that to a president of the United States who's standing screaming into a crowded mic of 30 or 40 million people that the election has been stolen, those things are dramatically different. Those things are not the same. I'm sorry. I understand the attempt to make those things the same, but they are not.
Well, here's my comeback on this one. You can criticize, and people have, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.'s formulation of that argument that, yelling fire in a crowded theater is actually protected speech, as some have said that it has. But what I see happening here is Trump's in the theater. He's watching the theater screen. He fools himself into thinking there's a fire, but it's on the screen of the TV. Is he justified in that? If he's enough of a fool to believe that actually happened, but he in his good faith, in what I can see as his internally credible appearing argument, whatever, should that be unprotected speech? Should he be held liable for that? Or isn't that just an extension of the exact same push against misinformation, quote unquote, against variants of free speech that just present alternative views of the facts on the ground? We got to close it out, but any real quick comeback on that, tomorrow?
Oh, no, this is a good conversation. I like it. Clearly, I disagree.
We'll be
but I like it.
Good combo. It's fun. No, we both like it. We're having fun, and I know we like each other. All right, we got to go into our big break today. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the show. Thank you to our guests, our callers, engineer. And thank you to Merle Thomas for fabulously co-hosting and arguing with us on this show. And thank you for listening. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back tomorrow, folks.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Guys, I'm sorry for the indignity of having to see me on this particular channel. It is embarrassing. I am very angry about having to be on this particular channel. I would rather be in my own home space. But for those of you that are joining me, thank you. I appreciate it. And I am working diligently to try to get the channel back. I've been in contact with YouTube over the past several days. I've sent many very angry emails and Twitter threads backing up my point and making the point to them that they have made a dramatic, serious, and indelible mistake. So hopefully, within the course of today, they fixes it. Otherwise, you'll see me here. I still want to thank you all for joining me, though. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and I will see you guys probably a little later